We'll do it again. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is John Morris. I'm the director of the Knight Alzheimer Disease Research Center here at Washington University. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this workshop on African American participation in Alzheimer research. We are so grateful for all of you taking the time to come and to participate. We're very eager to hear everyone's input, thoughts, discussion items, and plans that we can make to go forward. We are so appreciative of your time that hopefully you've all picked up your Knight ADRC chocolate bar, and I'll make some quick announcements and then we have some introductions to make. First, the restrooms, if you go out either door and turn to your right, you'll find the men's and the ladies' room. Second, please take your phones or other devices and put them on vibrate or turn them off. For anyone who parked at our registration desk out in the lobby, there will be the opportunity to get your parking ticket validated. Anyone who needs a business office, if you go out into the lobby and see the escalator, at the top of the escalator there will be a business office. At lunch, if you go out the exits of the auditorium and turn left, you'll find the rooms that are set up for lunch. It's very casual, eat wherever you feel comfortable. In your packet are evaluation forms. It looks like this. You might want to just take a look at it right now. I'm going to go through this and show you just as an exercise what it is we're interested in. So I'm looking at the ratings for the quality of the presentations. And if you take a look at that, you'll see maybe the fourth one down, John Morris being the speaker. If you all take out your pen and move over to 5, and just go ahead and fill that in now. When you complete your forms, our personnel will be at the doors or at the registration desk, and you can just turn them in to those individuals. We have a workshop organizing committee. They're listed in your packet. I won't go through all their names. And similarly for our funders, I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome, to give some remarks for this workshop, the Dean and Executive Vice Chancellor for Medical Affairs for Washington University School of Medicine, Dr. David Perlmutter. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, welcome to all of you, and it's really encouraging to see you come from different institutions and different organizations and try to work on how we're going to make a difference for this disease. And I mentioned this last night. I know there's not a one of us in this room that hasn't been touched in one way or another by this disease. So what you are doing, I applaud you. And we really have to begin to understand how the disease affects our African American communities. We have reason to believe that like in other diseases, it is different. And we need to understand that, and we need to make progress in being able to mitigate this problem. And so my applause to all of you for what you're doing. I know this is going to be an exciting day. Thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for coming to be here at Washington University School of Medicine.
Thank you, David. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Cerise Elliott from the National Institute on Aging, who would also make some welcoming remarks. So let's welcome Dr. Elliott.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you to Drs. Morris and Mulder, the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center staff, and the support from Washington University. We're thankful for Dr. Morris's leadership and willingness to gather all 30 NIA-funded AD centers to this location and embark on this effort to stimulate the discussion on African American participation in research. We hope that this event will truly spark the that's needed to make such a conversation not needed in the future. Because in the future, inclusion, diversity, and representation will be part of the scientific process and the scientific infrastructure. I would like to take this time to recognize our St. Louis community members that have chosen to join us this morning. Please raise your hand to be seen, and later this afternoon to be heard at the workshops if you're here. Thank you. At this moment in time, there are great resources and attention to finding a cure for Alzheimer's disease and its related dementias by 2025. This race to the cure has a serious inclusion problem as we look to our citizens to become volunteer participants. Minorities and underrepresented groups are under-enrolled in studies, and conclusions about disease risk factors and processes are being made without all the data because studies are not representative of all people and all life experiences. This morning, we'll be sharing information and findings that focus on the current status of Alzheimer's disease in African Americans. We'll review successful approaches to recruitment and retention and the effect that these approaches have on the science of Alzheimer's disease. We will also address the institutional challenges and required improvements that can be adopted to build healthy communities and healthy lives. The greatest outcome that will come from this day, with the input from all the wonderful community members that have joined us today, is to have a community-driven framework of improved approaches for not only Washington University, but every center here today representing an active network of AD research. An organized framework, our center network, and an active community feedback can amplify efforts, hopefully that are required for the last time, for true inclusion and representation in Alzheimer's disease research. One last item is that this month of October is a month of momentum on this topic as we start our morning here defining an updated framework for inclusive science. NIA will be releasing on Friday, October 19th, a national strategy for recruitment and participation in Alzheimer's disease research, crafted by many individuals in this room, and I want to take this moment to thank those for their participation on that 2-year journey for that document, so thank you. To capitalize on this document's release, we're going to be taking our discussion to the internet. On Tuesday, on October 23rd, we have an entire day dedicated to hashtag research diversity in the Twitter sphere. You can follow NIA at Alzheimer's_NIH, which is the National Education, or the NIA Education Resource Center. Where we will highlight the success and the challenges and motivate an additional audience to join the momentum that is beginning this morning and beginning right now. Thank you.
The workshop is being videotaped. It's streaming to different ADCs for representatives who could not be here today, and also to some chapters in the Alzheimer's Association. I think that the video will be available to anyone who wishes it beginning perhaps this Friday. So you can just go to our Knight ADRC website and have access to the video. Now I'm going to make one other announcement before we begin the presentations. During the lunch break, I am asking all speakers and moderators to come down here to the floor. We're going to take a photograph. I am asking all travel award recipients to come down here. We're going to take a photograph. And if I think of anyone else, I'll have you come down also. But no lunch for speakers or moderators until your photograph is taken. That's important. All right. So talk about how this began. William Hugh and colleagues at Emory published a paper a year ago suggesting that if we look at biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease in African Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites, we find differences, particularly in the concentrations of cerebral spinal fluid, total tau, and phosphorylated tau. We were doing similar studies at the same time and found very similar results. That paper now is in press in JAMA Neurology. However, you can see the sample sizes, and although for comparison of racial differences, these sample sizes are probably among the largest that have been reported, they still are small, and there's always a chance with small sample sizes in racial groups that will determine things that are incorrect, false results. So we need to improve African American participation in Alzheimer research to truly understand whether there are biomarker differences, biological differences, genetic differences, and so forth. And of course, to improve African American participation, we need to do a better job of being transparent and welcoming to people of color and to gain their trust. So this workshop is largely funded by a grant, that R13 from the National Institute on Aging, and I thank Cerise and Nina Silverberg for their terrific support as we went through the application process. We submitted it a little more than a year ago, August of 2017, and appreciate everyone who provided letters of support and other input to the application. You can see the specific aims. Why is it imperative that we include African Americans in research on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias? What are the barriers for African Americans to participate? What are the current efforts in the Alzheimer's Disease Center Network for recruitment and retention of African Americans? Importantly, how can we gain improvement of faculty and staff in terms of its diversity? And the bottom aim, the last aim, is to develop protocols that we can test to see if they, in fact, do improve African American participation in research. So that will be the outcome of the workshop, these protocols. We will seek funding to test some of them. By the way, the workshop also will generate a report. Cerise was talking about the report from October 19th meeting, but we'll have a report of this workshop as well, and we'll plan to publish it, but certainly we'll seek your input as we're developing it. We got the R13 grant application reviewed. It got a fundable score, and we got our notice of award in April. And we planned to have this workshop in conjunction with the Norman R. Say lecture that was delivered yesterday by Dr. Joy Ballsbury from Mayo Clinic and Dr. Carl Hill from the National Institute on Aging's Office of Special Populations. And I know many of you were here, and they certainly gave us the inspiration and the motivation to continue this work. We have 410 registrants. We're very pleased about that. And you can look around and see the wealth of talent and creativity and resolve that is assembled here today. It's really very exciting for us to have all of you here, and we look forward to your input. And as was mentioned, we have representatives from each of the funded Alzheimer's Disease Center networks. We're very pleased about that. So this is a photograph of the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center faculty and staff and African American Advisory Board members from 2015. You see we're a large group, very interdisciplinary, and I want to thank all of the ADRC faculty and staff for their contributions to this workshop and their help at registration desks and things of that sort. It's really a remarkably giving group, and I'm very deeply indebted to them. So I think that's what I just said. I particularly want to thank Andre Denny, Jennifer Phillips, Murda Spencer, Ron Hawley, and Krista Mulder, who went above and beyond to be responsible for the planning and the implementation of the workshop. We're very grateful to our funders, as has been commented, and we are particularly appreciative of the NIA awarding us the grant fund. And the Alzheimer's Association has funded 11 travel awards to early stage investigators. I'm going to embarrass them by having them stand as I call their name, and then at the end we'll give them all a round of applause. This was a competitive process, so they had to meet the criteria to be able to come here. So as I call your name, will you please stand, hold the applause at the end. Deanna Bird from Wayne State University, Stephanie Cresfonte from Florida Atlantic University, Casey Dieters from Stanford University, Tim Hughes from Wake Forest, Christian Lebu from UT Southwestern, Sam Lockhart from Wake Forest, Lauren Parker from Johns Hopkins, Annie Racine from Harvard, Sharia Robinson Lane, University of Michigan, Whitney Wharton from Emory University, and Layali Soleimani from the Icahn School of Medicine, Mount Sinai. Let's give them a round of applause. We have an ambitious agenda, very tight, many distinguished speakers. We want to hear from them all, so let's all adhere to the schedule. And at the end of each sessions, we will have a question and answer period, so hold your questions until that. But the meat of this workshop is at the end, the breakout sessions, where we're going to develop ideas that can be translated into research proposals to improve African American participation in Alzheimer's research. We have for each breakout session a moderator and a scribe, and we're going to hear reports from the first 3 breakout sessions at the end of the workshop. Dr. Elliott noted that a key part of this development of ideas and proposals will be members of the African American community. So we're very much encouraging those members to participate in whichever breakout session they want. It's voluntary which one you go to, but we want to hear from you rather than us developing ideas and then enforcing them on you. We'd like to hear from you what you think the proper approaches should be. So those we'll come back and we'll talk about that closer to the workshop, but that's the charge for all of us. All right, so we're going to begin session 1, African Americans in research for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. A very influential study, the Indianapolis Iban study, began in the 1990s, and we're delighted to have with us today an individual who's been an integral member of that team from the beginning, Sue Gao from the Department of Biostatistics, Indiana University School of Medicine. So let's welcome Dr. Gao. So that advances? Mm-hmm. That's a laser pointer.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Morris, for the introduction. I'm here to deliver this presentation on behalf of my distinguished colleagues. Dr. Hugh Hendry was a founding principal investigator for the Indianapolis Iban study. Last year, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by Alzheimer's Association. Dr. Hendry cannot be here today. He had to babysit his granddaughter. So he says at his age, he got his priorities straight. So that's why I'm here to deliver this presentation. Very briefly, the Indianapolis Iban Dementia Project is a 20-year project funded by the National Institute of Health. The study enrolled a cohort of African Americans from Indianapolis and at the same time, Nigerians from the city of Iban in Nigeria, Africa. The rationale for the study at the time was that international comparative studies from countries in different stages of development and with different cultures provide an ideal research environment for us to identify risk factors. The strength of our study design is that it used identical study procedures and identical timelines in both populations. Therefore, the difference we found in Alzheimer's disease and dementia rates can be attributed to differences in genetic and environmental exposures. So very quickly, I want to show a project timeline. So the study started in 1992, and this is where we enrolled the first cohort at baseline, about 2,000 African Americans from Indianapolis and around 2,500 from Nigeria. And then midway through the project, we added another 2 cohorts, about 2,000 each from each site. And totally, the project enrolled over 4,000 African Americans and 4,400 Nigerians. Each of the tick mark on this timeline represent an evaluation. So overall, there's 7 longitudinal evaluations conducted over the 20 years. So the first results I'm going to present are incidence rates. So when we looked at the 1992 cohorts and then the incidence rates for both dementia and Alzheimer's disease, if you look at the, go back. If you look at the overall age standardized rates for Nigeria, comparing to those in the African Americans, the rates are lower than about half in Nigerians, about lower than half of the African Americans for both dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So the next thing we compared is to say, okay, the rates for AD is lower in Nigerians. What else is happening in these 2 cohorts? So when we compared cardiovascular risk factors, you can see for the African Americans, a number of cardiovascular conditions, hypertension, diabetes, stroke, and smoking are all higher than in the Nigerians. In terms of metabolic markers that's measured by our study, you can also see BMI is a lot higher in African Americans than in the Nigerians, systolic blood pressure higher than the Nigerians, and cholesterol levels also higher than the Nigerians, although we didn't find any difference in diastolic blood pressure. So the next thing we compared are the incidence rates differences between the 1992 cohort and the cohort that we enrolled midway through the study. So the keep doing that. The age-specific rates for the original cohort is displayed in this solid red line, and the blue line represent the 2001 cohort rates, and the dashed lines are the confidence intervals. So that if the two dashed lines do not overlap, like in here, so that means the age-specific rates at this time point are statistically significant. So the 2001 cohort displays significantly lower incidence rates than the 1992 cohort. And then when we looked at the same situation in the Nigerians, the two incidence rates for the two cohort overlaps across all age groups. So there is no change in incidence rates for the Nigerians. And then so since we found a decline in incidence rates for the African Americans, the next thing we looked is what's changed over time. And then you could see here when we compared, when we compared the characteristic for the 1992 cohort to the 2001 cohort, what changed are years of education went up. There are fewer people who grow up in rural childhood upbringing. More people are having white-collar jobs, and less people are smoking. No change in the rate of alcohol consumption, and no change in the ApoE allele carrier. A number of cardiovascular conditions also increased, including hypertension, diabetes, and stroke rate. At the same time, treatment for these conditions, statin use, antihypertensive medication use, and anti-diabetic medication use also went up. So if you see in here, these medication use went up too. So there seem to be two things happening. The socioeconomic indexes that were reported to be associated with Alzheimer's disease, those factors improved over time between the two cohorts. Cardiovascular conditions actually increased, but at the same time, treatment for these conditions are also increasing. So next, what we did is we actually looked at each individual cardiovascular factors. So the first thing we looked is how does hypertension and antihypertensive medication use are associated with Alzheimer's disease and dementia, because there were previous studies that showing management of hypertension reduces risk for stroke and mortality. So the first study we did is in the African Americans. We looked at incidence cognitive impairment and how does the use of antihypertensive medication relates to cognitive impairment. So this is a busy slide, I know, but focus on the first highlighted line here. Basically what we've shown is any antihypertensive use is associated with reduced risk for cognitive impairment. And then two other facts that's interesting is no subclasses of antihypertensive medication were found to be driving this association. And then secondly, the effect of antihypertensive medication seemed to be mediated through blood pressure control. And then this plot, it's a contour plots. So if you think about it like trying to project a picture of on top of the mountain onto a two-dimensional surface. So we have systolic blood pressure on this axis and diastolic blood pressure on this axis. The height of the mountain is a cognitive score. So the higher the mountain, the higher the score. The peak of the mountain, this whitish circle in here, indicate those blood pressures with the highest cognitive score. So it centers around just lower than 140 on systolic and around 80 in diastolic. These group of individuals give us the highest cognitive score. And you also note that these blue areas on the outskirts of this mountain represent the lowest cognitive score. So low systolic blood pressure or high systolic blood pressure are associated with the lowest cognitive score. So these two analyses were done in the African Americans. We also looked into the Nigerian cohort. Remember, the Nigerians has low rates of hypertension, but even despite of that, we still find that having a history of hypertension increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and then higher systolic blood pressure, higher diastolic blood pressure, higher pulse pressure, which is a difference between systolic and diastolic, are all associated with increased risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So it seemed to be quite possible from all our analysis in both cohorts that hypertension, higher blood pressure increase the risk for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. From the African Americans, antihypertensive medications seem to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Next thing we looked is statin use with incidence Alzheimer's disease in the African Americans. So what we found is statin use at baseline is associated with reduced risk of incidence AD and also incident dementia. And interestingly, statin's effect on Alzheimer seemed not mediated by lipid level. So neither lipids nor CRP levels seem to interact with statin use. So that seemed to indicate an independent mechanism from the lipid management for statins. Next, we looked at how is diabetes associated with Alzheimer's disease. There have been research indicating diabetes increased risk for dementia and cognitive decline, especially in African Americans. Diabetes also appeared to be more severe in African Americans. So what we did is we merged the research database from Indianapolis Iban study with electronic medical records for the African American participants, and then looked at longitudinal glucose measures before a dementia diagnosis was given. So what we found is that this red line shows the group of individuals who didn't have dementia at the start points, and they developed dementia at the end. This time point is where a dementia diagnosis was given. We actually went back and looked at their longitudinal glucose trajectories. So these group of individuals who eventually develop dementia end up to be the ones who have higher glucose years before, and they showed a decline in glucose level over the years before dementia diagnosis. The other two lines, this black line is cognitive impairment, no dementia, and then this is a normal cognitive group. Those two groups seem to have a slow decline, no dramatic decline, and then no elevated glucose at the years before. So the next thing I want to show is a fascinating thing our study find. So for ApoE, in the African Americans, both double allele, homozygous for E4, and then carry just one single E4 allele, increase their risk for Alzheimer's disease. In the Nigerians, double E4 increase their risk. However, if they just carry one copy of the E4 allele, their risk doesn't seem to be significantly increased. Yeah, I'm finishing. So this slide, I will go really quickly. We found an interaction between ApoE and cholesterol in both cohorts, basically saying if you have E4, your risk is high. If you don't have E4, if you have high cholesterol, that's going to drive you to be comparable to almost having an E4 effect. And that's true in the Nigerian cohort as well. So just to summarize, we found that incidence rates for dementia and AD declining in the African Americans, but not in Nigerians. And we think the declining for the incidence rates were primarily due to the efficient management of cardiovascular risk factors. The differential effect of E4 remain to be explained. Then just a quick acknowledgement to the leaders of the study. Dr. Hendry, you're seeing, this is Dr. Ben Oceantoken for the PI of the Nigerian site. Dr. Kathleen Hall, who was a PI of the study for the second half of the study. And then acknowledging funding support from NIA and Alzheimer's Association. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue. And remember, save questions for the Q&A session. Delighted to introduce Rachel Whitmer, who's professor and chair of epidemiology at UC Davis, and she's been analyzing some of these questions using population-based databases. Welcome, Dr. Whitmer. Advance the slide back. That's the laser
That's
point.
the
Yeah.
laser pointer. Okay, thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here. I want to thank the Knight ADC and Dr. Morris for putting this together, and I want to acknowledge and thank the NIA and Dr. Elliott for also playing a large role in this very important meeting. And I was just very inspired yesterday by the talks. And I was telling a colleague that it made me want to change my slides up a bit, but I couldn't do that after the talks yesterday, but they are in my mind. So what am I going to be covering today? I would love to share with everyone how important it is to look at electronic data as a platform, and how epidemiology is really a wonderful population-based tool to understanding racial and ethnic differences in dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And we can turn to it to not only understand rates, but also the role of social contributions, because I think that's something that is often overlooked. And then I'm going to end with some new cohort studies that we have launched and talk about where do we need to look next. So this is a very busy slide. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but the bottom line here is that as a field, we really struggle to put together population-based studies that emulate our current demographic in the United States. But the truth is that we should be looking at projections, and we should be trying to put together cohorts that will emulate the future demographics of the US. So it's not enough just to say, I have a certain number of ethnic minorities in my groups, but we actually need to oversample. This way, in the future, we will be poised to most adequately help these parts of the population. So when we're thinking about epidemiology, we always have to take a step back and say, who are we studying? And it sounds really obvious, but who you study and who you enroll and who you contact and who decides to be in your research study has a big impact on your findings. It's really important to acknowledge that we need to have a life course perspective, and we're going to be hearing much more detail about that later today from Professor Jennifer Manley. We need to think about diversity beyond race, and I will be touching on that we're talking about racial ethnic differences, but we also need to acknowledge that there are individuals in rural areas and with very low levels of education that also often get overlooked and are harder to recruit and include in a study. So what is epidemiology? Often we get accused of only counting, and I'm actually teaching a graduate course right now, Introduction to Epidemiology, and if there's one thing I hope to achieve is that they come away from it knowing that we are not just counting. So we want to do the study and the analysis of the distribution and the causes of health and certain conditions and diseases. And how you do that can tell you where to look more closely. So it's almost like a detective work. We also deal with the incidence of disease, and by understanding that, we hope to have a public health approach where we could possibly modify or control disease. We need to think about ways to make this translational. And what's wonderful now is with the advances in technology, we are poised and we are in a situation where we can do very, very deep phenotyping. But we have to weigh that with who ends up in our population cohort. So who we study and how we study them absolutely matters. So I like to show this scale because this is something I always think about and struggle with as a scientist, and I think many of the scientists here in the room struggle with this as well. We want to have breadth, we want to have large representative studies, but we also want to have depth. We want to take pictures of one's brain. We want to collect blood and store it in a biobank. We would love if someone is willing to donate their brain after death. So we need to do all those things. But at the same time, the more we require an individual to do, the less representative our studies become. So this is something that we need to always keep in mind. And what's wonderful about today and the talks today is we're going to be really digging in and thinking about not only effective African American participation in research, but also thinking about being comfortable with being part of these very in-depth studies. And that's something as a field, again, we have to take a step back and say, we need racial and ethnic diversity, we need diversity in rural versus urban settings, and we need geographic diversity as well. And so how to talk to everyone and get everyone to feel comfortable. One of the things that's very tricky when you're looking at risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and I would love to give a shout out to the wonderful talk right before me with Dr. Gao, that's done some really great work in this area, is that when we're looking at risk factors for dementia or Alzheimer's disease, often risk factors and exposures vary. They vary by men versus women, they can vary by racial ethnic groups. And the rate of death from these risk factors also varies. So this is an example from Dr. Elizabeth Rose Maeda, who's at UCLA. And this is just one example if you wanted to look at hypertension in midlife and long-term risk of dementia. What happens if individuals die at different rates from hypertension? And we know that African Americans in this country are much more likely to have hypertension. So you can actually come away with a finding that is not exactly accurate, because if you look at this, what happens is if those individuals with hypertension are not as likely to live to an age where they can get dementia, you will come away with a finding that looks like hypertension in midlife might not be a risk factor. And that's a very wrong finding. So when we're looking at long-term data, we need to appreciate and acknowledge and take into account the most appropriate and best methods for understanding competing risk and different patterns in mortality across different demographics. So how can we leverage electronic health records to understand brain health on a population level? And I actually don't have anything else on this slide. I just have these words here because I do think that looking at electronic health records in healthcare delivery systems is not going to tell you what's causing dementia, but it is going to tell you who, and it is going to tell you where to look more closely. And I think at this point, people are starting to turn to the electronic health record as a means for leveraging this, but I think there's a lot more that we could do. So it is a platform for signaling. So it tends to be underutilized. Another nice thing about electronic data is you can look at new groups. It is 2018, but there are actually parts of the US, parts of the population here in the US that have never been in any research studies for Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So you can at least start, if you have some of them in your healthcare delivery system, even looking at rates there. You can understand new risk factors. There are risk factors that one cannot always collect in a cohort study. We had a study looking at very acute low blood sugar episodes, very severe hypoglycemic episodes among those with type 2 diabetes, and it was a very strong risk factor for dementia. That's not something that you can typically collect even in a cohort study. Those individuals are too sick, they probably don't want to even be in your study. But this is something you can look at in electronic records. You can also understand timing of risk factors, which, as I mentioned before, is really key, because when we're thinking about diversity in understanding Alzheimer's disease and dementia, we need to acknowledge that people have different exposures to risk factors, and risk factors may affect different populations at different points in time. So I'm going to jump ahead and show you some data of a very large study that we did. Let me go back. So this was a study that I did with Dr. Elizabeth Rose Maeda, which was looking at incidence of dementia over 13 years in 274,000 Kaiser members. And this study has a lot of people in it, and it has a lot of different racial ethnic groups and a lot of person time, and you can see 80% had more than one healthcare visit every year. The bottom line from this study is that, yes, we saw that African Americans have a higher rate and risk of dementia, but the difference between our African Americans and other groups was smaller in magnitude compared to studies that have been sourced from memory clinics. This was also the very first study to look at American Indians and Alaskan Natives, and they also have a very high rate, and we don't know why. So there is power in leveraging these resources to understand this. We looked at competing risk of death in different ways, and we saw the same pattern overall, that our African Americans have the highest rate, followed by our Native Americans. So why do we care? Well, the size of the difference was actually something that we hadn't seen in comparison to memory clinic-based studies. And our Asian Americans had a very low rate, and this was actually the first time anyone had looked at Asian Americans comprehensively. There's been really beautiful work from the Honolulu Asian study and the Kame study, but this was the first time one had looked at all Asian Americans, which in and of themselves is a very heterogeneous group and something we want to further explore. So what we don't know is the progression in some of these groups from normal aging to cognitive decline, and how social context can play a role. And when we're talking about racial differences, sometimes folks like to focus on biology, but I think in this country, it is a misnomer if you don't appreciate and take into account the very large psychosocial and sociocultural differences historically in different ethnic and minority groups, and how that could possibly affect risk of disease. I'm going to jump ahead to some work done by Dr. Paula Gil-Sanz, which was looking at our Kaiser members in Northern California and those who were born in a high stroke mortality state. So all these individuals were part of Kaiser in Northern California by midlife, but some of them had been born in a high stroke mortality state. And so you can see here that if you are African American, you have a 32% higher risk, and this is taking into account vascular risk factors and differences in education. And that's among people born outside of a high stroke mortality state. If you were born in a high stroke mortality state, that is a risk factor whether you are white or black, but you can see that the magnitude is a bit larger. So this is a risk factor that is ubiquitous across all different racial groups, but our African Americans in this study were much more likely to have been exposed to this risk factor. They were much more likely to have been born in one of these states. So we need to acknowledge psychosocial differences in life course. So there's a lot that we still don't know. We don't understand the progression from normal cognitive aging to decline. So I'm going to touch on some new cohort studies that we've launched. Our CANDLE study is 1,600 people, 4 different racial ethnic groups, and we are doing amyloid PET and MRI on 200 of them and carefully looking at their cognition and incident dementia. We're almost at the end of wave 1. I think we have 6 weeks left and we're going to hit our target. And then we're starting to see people next month for their second visit. We like to use information that is accessible. We like to use infographics. This is something that has been shown that works across education level. It's very important to show little photos of what you are doing. We've been very successful in this study in recruiting individuals of different racial ethnic groups. The part we've had to put a lot of resources in is recruiting those with low education. So 11% of our sample has less than a high school education. We had wanted to have 20%. And it is very hard to reach these individuals. There's a very high cancellation and reschedule rate, so this is something we're really actively working on. I'm going to skip ahead to the end here. So we also have our Kaiser STAR study, and Dr. Lisa Barnes is a co-investigator. This is a study of 700 African Americans. Half are between the ages of 50 and 64, and half are 65 plus. And we are looking at cognitive aging and transition to MCI. And then I'm going to end with, this is a photo of our infographic. I'm going to end with our last study, which was just launched this summer, and Dr. Maria Carrata is a co-PI with me on this, and this is looking at oldest old, so those that are ages 90 and above in an ethnically diverse cohort. And we have 140 folks so far. We are following them, seeing them every 6 months for cognition and a dementia exam, and we are approaching all of them for brain donation. So we hope with these cohort studies that we can fill the gap in what has not been known in these population studies and really embracing diversity. So to end, I hope that you agree by the end of this talk with some of these statements. Risk factors can operate differently at different time points. Understanding brain health is just as important as looking at dementia. We need innovative methods, and still, we've come a long way, but groups which are most vulnerable to dementia have not been well represented yet in research. And I know that's one of the goals of this meeting today, is that we really want to change that. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rachel. We're going to invite Goldie Bird to present on the genetic factors for Alzheimer's disease in African Americans. Goldie is a former Norman R. Say lecturer, and just about a month ago became the director of the Maya Angelou Center for Health Equity at Wake Forest. So, Goldie. Is it Nancy's? That's your laser pointer. If you have to go back, it's the red.
Good morning. I want to thank Dr. Morris for the invitation to come back. It's been wonderful. Certainly yesterday was really enlightening, and this morning as well. And also NIH and the Alzheimer's Association for your support, and others. I am delighted to be here this morning. I have no relevant financial disclosures, as I am delighted to talk about this work, and I have not engaged in that yet. So I want to talk about Alzheimer's genetics just a little bit, and I don't have a genetics lecture this morning, so I'm not going to do a lot of talking about that. And then investigating AD genetics in African Americans. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a university model for closing gaps in health disparities, and particularly targeting Alzheimer's disease in African Americans, and then some recommendations for going forward that we believe could be effective. As the previous speaker said, some of the most needed people most needed in Alzheimer's research are not included at a great extent, and so we want to change that. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about some things that we could do, I believe that we could do to change that trajectory. So Dr. Collins, a few years back, says, except for some cases of trauma, it is fair to say that virtually every human illness has a hereditary component. And we've come a long way from there, and there's still, jury's still out for some people on that, but we believe that Alzheimer's disease genetics is really critical to understanding what is happening, and particularly in underrepresented groups. Of course, as you know, Alzheimer's disease is a health disparity. The Alzheimer's Association says that about twice more in African Americans. It also occurs more in women. And at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference this year, there was quite a bit of discussion around why women are more affected, and also about caring for persons with Alzheimer's disease, which is an area that we really focused in on at our center, because in order to get to some of the patients that we want to get to, it's important to understand the dynamic of how they're being cared for, who's caring for them, and what kind of consent you're going to get when you're working with a patient who is elderly, who has Alzheimer's disease and may not be able to speak for him or herself. So Alzheimer's genetics is really relatively young, if you will, and prior to about 1988, very little was known. And I put this slide here because I became involved in Alzheimer's genetics with Dr. Margaret Perchek-Vance. She's the one in the red, and people who know her now you know that her hair is not that color, but, and we tease about that. But this is a relatively new area for study. And the discovery of the ApoE genetic risk factor in AD really revolutionized the field of complex disease genetics. And so we know now that other genes are really very important in Alzheimer's genetics, and particularly the ABCA7 gene that came out with the GWAS study in 2013. So this gene was discovered in the 90s and with Dr. Vance and others, and it's involved in cholesterol storage and transport and metabolism, and it's really the most commonly known genetic determinant of susceptibility to Alzheimer's disease, found both in familial and sporadic AD, and of course risks are sex and race dependent. And ApoE has a smaller effect on African Americans than in individuals of European heritage. And that's the basis for a number of ideas about Alzheimer's genetics. We all inherit two forms of this, and I won't go deeply into this, but the good copy appears to decrease risk and increases age of onset. Then there's a neutral copy, ApoE3. The most common form neither increases nor decreases risk for the most part, and then the ApoE4, which we consider as the bad copy, if you will. And of course, it increases risk and decreases age of onset. Jury's still out on ApoE4 in African Americans, as the previous speaker suggested, and it makes it even more important that we think about Alzheimer's genetics with regard to people of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, by the way. Risk and age of onset of AD depends on the ApoE allele and the number of copies. So again, African Americans are more likely to develop AD and dementia compared to non-Hispanic white populations. And this population has other risks that are disproportionately disproportionately burdens this group, including poor treatment outcomes, age at onset, diagnosis. Many people are living alone, quite frankly, and have Alzheimer's disease and don't even know they have it. So there are some basic questions. Are there differences between the genetic or DNA sequence of those who have Alzheimer's disease and those who do not? And then can researchers really detect the differences? And without going into a lot of depth about the genetics and how things are happening, suffice it to say that the technology has really improved over the last few years, from linkage studies to genome-wide association studies to whole genome sequencing and whole exome sequencing. And that technology continues to improve daily. And with the increases in funding, we are able to look forward to more advanced technology. Of course, early on, there was nothing in the literature about African Americans and Alzheimer's disease. And when we began this work, when I joined the group in about 15 years ago, there was absolutely nothing there. So we began to expand the genetics of Alzheimer's disease in African Americans with groups of individuals from North Carolina A&T State University, University of Miami, Columbia University investigators, and those at Vanderbilt University who are now at Case Western. And so we began to prepare for this study really by conducting research before we did the research. We did a huge feasibility study which actually looked into the community and began to get questions answered about the community before we began to do the research. And then we began to create the kind of partnerships that would yield engagement and participation. We did this through awareness, critical awareness, education, reciprocity and presence, and then the genetics research actually came last. We did a study where we looked at 500 intergenerational participants, and it was really important for us to look at intergenerational participants because, as we all know, individuals who care for individuals who have Alzheimer's disease, late onset Alzheimer's disease, are younger people, including students who are caring for parents and grandparents in this population. Most of our participants were women, and that's been the case throughout our studies over the years, and that's a critical issue with Alzheimer's disease. We have to begin to look at men in studies as well as what they are experiencing in caregiving. So we looked at these are some data points that we looked at, and we looked at people's willingness to participate in studies. And as you can see across the board, more than 50% of participants in each of the groups stated that they would be willing to participate in studies. Now, this is different from much of what is in the literature, even though there are recent studies which says, yes, African Americans are willing in spite of the fact of the knowledge of the Tuskegee experiment. Yet there was a recent article, I believe just in 2018, which says that African Americans are less likely. So the jury's still out on that. And so this is something that we really need to improve and be consistent about our reporting on this fact. We looked at the age range. Again, our study was intergenerational, so we looked at people from age 18 to over 70 years of age. And again, we asked folks about their motivation for participating. Why would you want to participate? And we did this intergenerationally, and relative with disease, of course, I have the disease is very important. Money compensation was there and it was important, but as people age, as you can see, it was less important. Of course, young people are interested in getting a few dollars if they can, but as people age, we become more intentional about curing a disease or providing some intervention for a disease that is really burdensome to our communities. I'm going to skip that one. One of the things the reason I threw this pedigree up, and this was again at A&T, I've only been at Wake Forest for about 3 or 4 weeks, and so I'm presenting what we did there. But just to show you the burden of Alzheimer's disease, these are some of our actual patients, and the burden of disease in these families, and yet there is an inability, quite frankly, often to understand what is happening, and there's not a good consistent pattern often in terms of inheritance. So we wanted to remove barriers to minority participation in health-related research studies, and we knew we had an uphill battle because culturally, about 15 years ago, this was really difficult to think that we were going into the community without a good track record of engaging African American communities in a way that was effective. So we wanted to remove some of the barriers of this. And what we found was that people had participated, more often than not, had participated in studies before, which means that African Americans will participate more than one time. Again, we looked at the kinds of research studies that people were interested in. And then we looked at people who had not participated and whether or not they would be willing to participate in the past. All of these signals were very positive. And yet the data show, the literature says that African Americans would not participate. And then just want to bring this to your attention about surrogate consent, which is really critical and is really a prickly subject for people who are caring for individuals with Alzheimer's disease. This is a study that we did early on and showed that as we began to create opportunities to target our recruitment, that we made a difference over a 10-year period with just open enrollment. This is what we got on the left, and then to the right in just a year and a half, we made a significant increase. I'm going to just skip that one. So what did we do after finding out really working with community and finding out what the community needed? We created a Center for Outreach in Alzheimer's, Aging, and Community Health to provide dignified ways to engage with community. So without going into depth, these are the things that we did, most of which we asked people what they needed for us to do and to sustain their interest in not only research, as quite frankly, the center was created for other purposes. It wasn't created for recruitment. It was actually created to help families and to help communities empower themselves around Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's management, Alzheimer's care, and then in terms of education around other disease states and conditions. So these are some of the things that we did to remain engaged. And this summer, they time is up. This summer, the center created a family navigation program to keep families together and to help them to help with caregiving. What happened here is that our recruitment rates went out of the roof because families were helping other family members to get engaged. And of course, these are some of the things that we do like now is that the public, Alzheimer's disease is a part of our zeitgeist. We're really seeing it more, and so therefore we're reducing stigma around it. These are just some things that I thought I would leave you with. With funding, we can be bold, serious, and provocative, and we can consider ways to reach this population that are dignified, and I do say dignified, and that create trusting relationships. We had an awesome trust relationship at the University of Maryland this summer, so we need to learn how to do that. Create these sustained partnerships that are meaningful, not just one hit, improve the research tools, focus teams and networks, advance strategies that increase enrollment and engage communities of color, including intergenerational people as well as universities of color. And so some of the results, finally, of our continuous and inclusive and engagement are, it improves the generalizability of our studies. We have over a 90% consistently retention rate. We spend less money on calls and follow-ups, and folks come to us. And then we leave dignity in the community as a result. And my center's namesake, Dr. Maya Angelou, says, I believe the responsibility for tomorrow is in our hands, and that means we need to look a little bit deeper, work a little bit harder to make sure that our work is inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Goldie. That was terrific. Do you see a slide up here? There we go. So here are my disclosures. We're very fortunate to be funded by the National Institute on Aging, and we also have support from a foundation and the Alzheimer Association. I've shown this slide before, the Knight ADRC faculty. I want to thank the individuals listed here who participated productively in this study, the results of which I'm about to present to you, and particularly these four individuals who were very helpful in the analytic phase of the study. So why study underrepresented groups? Our population, we've heard, is aging, but it's also becoming increasingly diverse. By 2050, 40% or more of older adults will be minorities. In Alzheimer research, as we all know, almost all comprehensive biomarker studies come from non-Hispanic whites. This is a missed opportunity then to understand factors and mechanisms that might cause Alzheimer's disease in other racial groups if we limit our studies to whites only. The data are, as we've been discussing, very forbidding. African Americans are poorly represented in research cohorts. A publication this January of this year about the phase 3 expedition trial of solanezumab had over 2,000 participants, only 33 of whom were African American. In St. Louis, African Americans are by far our largest underrepresented group, about 18% in the metropolitan region, and of people 65 and older, it's about 13%. But Hispanics and Asians each are less than 3%, so we study African Americans here at the Knight Alzheimer's Center. We heard from Dr. Gao that there's a much less risk of ApoE4 in Nigerians for Alzheimer's disease. Studies have in the African Americans, including from Columbia University, have shown similar findings. We also know from work from Dr. David Holtzman's laboratory that ApoE4, we think of it as, of course, a mediator of amyloid beta, but it also influences tau pathogenesis and tau-mediated pathology. independent of A beta. So interactions of ApoE4 with tau in African Americans potentially could differ from its interactions with whites. We've heard about the comorbidities today, the cardiovascular risk factors in particular. We'll hear throughout the day about other non-genetic explanations for some potential racial differences in African Americans and non-Hispanic whites, including socioeconomic disparities and psychosocial factors. So the question is, are the biologic mechanisms underlying Alzheimer's disease identical for non-Hispanic whites and for African Americans? And so we decided to look at this, but as I mentioned yesterday in the SAY lecture, 1997, we would not have been able to examine research questions about racial differences because we had in our cohorts, longitudinal cohorts, very few African Americans, fewer than 3%. I mentioned yesterday Norman Arce in 2000 was the founding chair of our African American Advisory Board. They've been very influential in our understanding of becoming culturally competent and welcoming, and so with their help we've been able to increase the cohort percentage of African American to 18%, so comparable to the metropolitan area. However, we have to be very careful. In 2004, we really launched intensive biomarker assessments of all of our participants, amyloid PET, brain MR, and cerebral spinal fluid. We expected that of all new enrollees, and this just shows our naivete that had a very profound effect on African American enrollment. It decreased remarkably, so we had to be sensitive to that. In 2006, we no longer required mandatory lumbar puncture for African Americans. In our cohort of older adults, these are individuals 65 and older, 744. As I mentioned, we have 18% African Americans, but even so, African Americans participate less fully in our cohort than do their counterparts. For example, we evaluate people annually, and most of the average number of assessments of our participants is 6, but it's less for African Americans. We don't retain them as well. The voluntary autopsy rate for our total cohort is about 64%. It's less for African Americans, 50%. And I've already mentioned lumbar puncture. We have a high completion rate in our general cohort of 71%, but for African Americans it's 38%. So we're not addressing all of the concerns that are needed to have fuller participation. So our particular study took 1,215 individuals. Now we have a middle-age cohort, so we included them, people 45 and up through, I think, age 89, and who were either cognitively normal or who had symptomatic Alzheimer's disease and had been assessed from 2004 through 2015 and had had at least one brain MRI and or amyloid PET with PIB and or CSF assays for A-beta-42, tau, and phosphorylated tau. Of that 1,215, 14% or 173 were African American. And we're just reporting today cross-sectional analyses. We don't have enough longitudinal data to do appropriate analyses. And we had either analyses of variance or analyses of covariance, and you can see the covariates there. We adjusted hippocampal volumes for intracranial volume, and our standard uptake value ratios for PET-PIB were partial volume corrected. So here's the demographics of the group, total group, broken down into African Americans, 173 versus non-Hispanic whites, 1,082, age identical, mean age identical. As has already been pointed out, more African American women tend to participate in this type of research than do compared to whites. Both groups were highly educated, but the non-Hispanic whites more educated in terms of years of education. No difference in the frequency of ApoE4 allele, but a greater history of dementia in the non-Hispanic whites compared to the African Americans. In terms of clinical status, we're largely looking at cognitively normal people, clinical dementia rating 0. That was about 2/3 of each racial group, and about 1/3 then had symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. BMI, higher in African Americans, as was hemoglobin A1C. We evaluated all the brain MRIs for any ischemic lesions and did not find a difference between African Americans and whites. So looking at amyloid imaging with PIB by race, we have also done amyloid imaging with florbetapir, but here reporting only PET PIB data, and we really see no difference in the amount of amyloid burden compared by racial differences. It's really no significant differences. So at least by PET amyloid imaging, African Americans and non-Hispanic whites have the same profile, of course. As age increases, the amount of amyloid deposition increases as well. So this just says there's no difference either by, of course we see the expected increase in amyloid burden when people are symptomatic, CDR greater than 0. We see this in both groups, and we see the same for those who are ApoE4 higher in both racial groups compared to non-E4 carriers. So the cerebral spinal fluid, again, there are the covariates for which we adjusted. I've mentioned the demographic differences. If you look at CSF A beta 42, no difference in statistical difference between the concentrations of A beta 42 in African Americans compared to whites, but tau is different. So CSF total tau is lower in African Americans compared to whites, as is phosphorylated tau. We see the expected difference. People who are symptomatic have higher CSF tau than people who are not symptomatic, who are cognitively normal, in both African Americans and in whites, but again, always in African Americans for total tau, and for phosphorylated tau, it's lower. And again, we see the same pattern for those who are E4 positive, lower in both African Americans. So we see the same profile, but the absolute values differ. And here is just plotted by age. See the African Americans in red and non-Hispanic whites in green. So statistical difference. So very preliminary findings. We have the same Alzheimer biosignature for molecular biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. 1, amyloid burden varies as a function of clinical status. People who are symptomatic have higher amyloid burden, this as measured by PET-PIB, and lower CSF A beta levels in both racial groups. We also see that the CSF concentrations of tau and phospho-tau also vary as a function of clinical status, higher in people who are CDR 0 compared to cognitively normal people. We, in both racial groups, have the same ApoE effect, higher amyloid burden in people who are E4 carrier. In both racial groups, I didn't show this, have lower hippocampal volumes in people who are symptomatic, CDR greater than 0 than those who are cognitively normal. So I've shown, shown that the, good thing I'm not a neurosurgeon. CSF A beta 42, amyloid levels either measured by PIB or by CSF, the same in African Americans and whites. But what we found, and this is what William Hugh and his group found at Emory as well, is that African Americans have a lower CSF, total tau, and phosphorylated tau than whites. So, conclusions. Well, in order to begin to examine these potential differences and further to try to understand them, we need to include diverse groups in all aspects of research and to look at the relevant factors. But a take-home message would be if you have a pool of CSF from your participants and you don't adjust for racial differences, that's probably inappropriate. You now must adjust for race. They're not the same. And this is important because those of you engaged in clinical trials of experimental therapies for Alzheimer's disease, now a prerequisite for entry into the trial is you must meet a biomarker standard, and it may differ in different racial groups. So we need to understand these biomarker values in all groups. And I think that's it. So thanks very much. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Gao and Dr. Whitmer and Dr. Bird to come and have a seat here at the table, and we'll entertain some questions. Okay, good, okay. All right, we'll start with Monica. Do you have a question?
I actually have two questions. One of them is for Dr. Bird. She specifically said recruitment with dignity. Can you provide an example of what's not dignified and what is dignified? Because I think some people don't necessarily understand that. What's dignified recruitment and what's not dignified? Monica.
Monica, right here. Pull that, yeah, ready to go.
Things that we've heard from participants and community persons is of course, their distrust, but also the way that investigators engage them. In other words, they say that investigators want their blood, they want an LP, a lumbar puncture, or they want some CSF fluid, and then they know nothing. They don't know enough about the disease. They don't know follow-up from it, what their participation. So we find that they believe that that is a very undignified way. And many people are signing off, providing consent for things they have no idea what they're signing. And so I think we need to do a better job of making sure that we're engaging at an appropriate level so that people can understand. They also feel that many often feel, and I'm just quoting from some of the data that we recently got in the community, that many people feel that something is wrong with them because we see more Alzheimer's disease, and that's not being explained well. And so when I say undignified, it's this idea, if I do a few things for you, you're gonna give a sample or you're going to engage, but really not understanding what the community is doing in research, and I think that's a real big problem.
Do you have a second question?
Well, the second one had to do with lumbar punctures are no longer mandatory, so what biomarkers are you looking at in African Americans if they don't want to do an LP?
I think you're directing that to me, okay? So, so our idea about the mandatory lumbar puncture when we moved to full molecular biomarker studies was we were trying to improve the amount of biomarkers that we would be able to obtain from all participants. We clearly did not explain that well to our African Americans. We do find greater participation rates for our African Americans in volumetric brain MRI and in PET scans. And we hope that if we don't require that for enrollment into our studies, that if African Americans participate with us for some period of time, that we will gain their trust, and we will be better able to explain the rationale for lumbar puncture, and hopefully with time be able to clear up any misconceptions. So we think with having African Americans participate longitudinally in research ultimately may allow us to gain lumbar puncture in more African Americans than we thought. Was there a question over? Yeah. Was that Nina?
Yes, Nina Silverberg from NIA. Thank you all for a terrific start to this very important meeting, and thank you, John, for organizing it. I have two questions. One is actually to follow up on that. How is your success with getting blood biomarkers from African Americans? And I guess that can apply to everyone, but start with.
For us, it is something like 95%. For our non-Hispanic whites, it's closer to 99%. So, but blood is not an issue, does not seem to be an issue.
John?
Oh, I have a second question. I was just waiting for other responses to that.
Rachel, do you want to talk about the success rate?
Yeah, Nina was looking at me, so I wanted to answer. We also have not had a issue with blood. Our rates of agreement to give blood are the same across all of our different groups.
Yeah, blood is not an issue for us.
Okay, and my second question is about making samples and data available for sharing. Since we were lucky enough to have some young investigators here, and we have young investigators across the country who may be interested in all of your and other data and samples for their research. What are the challenges and successes, hopefully, with sharing that data and those samples?
So Nina, as an NIA-funded Alzheimer's center, we refuse to share our data or samples. No, we welcome requests for our resources, including the biospecimens. We welcome that. Again, on our website, there's easy access to making a request for the samples, and we almost always approve that. We have to be certain that for CSF in particular, that we don't deplete our resources in any particular individual. So if we can support it, we are happy to do that, and we encourage that, including our young investigators. Dr. Holtzman?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, you had one more? Oh, you wanted responses from others.
For me, since I'm the statistician for the Indianapolis Iban study, I think the challenge is resources. Almost once a week, we got an email from all kinds of researchers from all over the world, including students doing PhD studies and postdocs who want to look into our data. The issue is that one is administrative. They have to sign this data user agreement. Dr. Henry has been taking care of that part, communicating with people. But once the agreement is signed, we really have to have some resources from the biostat point of view to subset, make sure data are de-identified and get to the right people in the right way. So that resources right now is basically coming from just our staff donating the efforts, sort of thing.
Yeah, so to answer that question, we also make our data available for sharing. The challenge that frustrates me is that it just gets held up with the institutions. It's just months of paperwork and lawyers and signing stuff, and I just wish that that process was more streamlined. But also to reiterate the point that was also just said is that when you write these grants, you come up with a data sharing plan, but you sometimes don't think ahead to the resources that are needed, which is biostats and programmer support, because you want to make sure this data is ready to share quickly and efficiently before it then sits with the lawyers for 6 months to get signed off.
Okay, Dave?
Dave Holtzman from Washington University. So, John, I think the data that you presented, as well as that of William Hugh and colleagues, certainly strongly argues the value of getting quantitative endophenotypes in populations like African Americans. And it looks like the data suggests that there's probably a genetic factor or some sort of factor in African Americans that either protects against the effects of amyloid deposition or of ApoE4 or both. So given your data and William's data, are there efforts if we're going to really understand what that genetic factor or factors are, we're going to have to probably get samples from across the country and genetics from across the country in this population. So are there efforts to try to do that in a more systematic way to validate and maybe find a factor that would suggest even a new target for therapy?
Yeah, a very critical question. As William and I and our colleagues have discussed this, we've entered, at least in principle, an agreement to share our CSF samples, both those that we've already collected and those that we will collect prospectively with Emory, and Emory will do the same. So we both are very intrigued about these differences, and yet we need to validate them in larger sample sizes and explore additional differences. So since we're committed to this, there's that interinstitutional agreement in principle. We are seeking funding to allow the processing of the tissue and the shipping and so forth and the analysis. But this way, I think both centers will double the amount of samples they have available. If we can get this going with Emory, we'd like then to translate that to the Alzheimer's Disease Center network as a whole and see if we can gain some even greater sample sizes that way. Okay. Jonathan?
Hi, Jonathan Jackson from Mass General Hospital. So this question is primarily directed at Dr. Whitmer, but I'd like all the panelists to respond if they feel comfortable. So Dr. Whitmer, you said during your presentation that it's important to recognize two things. So first of all, the diversity within diversity. And then secondly, that we need to be developing populations and samples, not for the population that we see now, but for the population of the future. I was wondering if you might be able to speak to who's missing from the population of the future, especially with regards to thinking about Black Americans, and I'm using that term as distinct from African Americans, it's the more inclusive term. Who's missing from our data analysis, especially given the 4 wonderful presentations that we saw here, in order for us to have these samples of the future?
So I think we've made great gains in thinking about diversity in terms of maybe racial groups and color, but I think we still have a long way to go. And I think currently what's missing is heterogeneity in education across all racial groups. And I think that's something that we need to really work on as a field. So to me, that's one of the largest things missing. And I know you had a question before that. You had 2 points. What was your first question? That was it. Yeah, so for me, so for what I see in the work and where I think we need to focus is on education levels, geographic diversity. I think, access to places that can properly evaluate biomarkers. So where can you get an amyloid PET? It might be hard if you're living in a rural area. So I think this is where we need to really focus our efforts on as well, to create studies that do reflect everyone. There are certainly challenges with it, but that's why we're here.
All right, in order to last question.
Thank you. Jill Waring from St. Louis University. I had a question for each of the panelists, whether you provide individual results to participants along with an accessible level of interpretation, and if you don't, whether doing so could speak to the dignity component that was raised earlier, and if you were to do so, how you might go about doing that at an accessible level of understanding.
All right, so I'll take a stab, it's a very important question, and Sue and Rachel and Goldie will have much better insight than I, but I'm not going to have them respond in the interest of time because we want to stay on schedule. So individual research results to participants. Many participants would like access to those results, particularly for biomarker studies. They don't always understand the potential issues that are involved in that. So, for example, the fact that it's very difficult to explain Alzheimer risk based upon a positive PET scan or a CSF analysis, So how to deliver those results and what to do with them is going to take some education and some time to answer questions. And so that's not something that typically we've been set up to do, but we're examining ways to do this. Dr. Sarah Hartz and Dr. Jessica Mazurski here at the Alzheimer's Center have completed a pilot study about the way to deliver those results. And now we would like to do that in a much larger scale for our participants, but at the same time to monitor the effect of returning those results. So for example, a study from University of California, San Diego indicated that when they delivered the ApoE4 status to their participants, those who were E4 positive began to perform more poorly on their longitudinal psychometric data because they thought they were developing the disease. They had some concern about that. So it's a very important question. I don't have a straight answer yet. Sarah and Jessica are working out the protocol to do this. But I think this is something, it's a very important issue for all Alzheimer's centers to try to address. So thank you for the question. And let's thank Rachel, Sue, and Goldie for their presentations. And we now are going to move to session 2, African American Alzheimer's disease and related disorders research participation, current status. And Goldie, you're the moderator. You tried to get out of there. You need the, let me do this for you. How's that? So it's just two speakers, yep. Crystal Glover. Yep. Sorry. No, there's a break right after this.
Okay. Session 2. So the next session is African American ADRD research participation, current status. We'd like to invite Dr. Crystal Glover. Dr. Glover is assistant professor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Rush University Medical Center and Rush ADRC.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Crystal Glover. I'm going to talk a bit about barriers to research participation, but also facilitators, as I believe it to be more balanced. So we know the issue here being... Can everyone hear? Can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Is that better? Yes. So we know the issue here is underrepresentation of African Americans in research. But also, we know the big consequences of that. We are unable to have a basic understanding of what is perceived and what's real as health issues for African Americans. So we don't know what they're going through, their health issues, how they view them, their medical conditions. So we are therefore unable to identify these issues and key their potential solutions. So for me, thinking about inclusion in research is a no-brainer. I don't feel the need, particularly to justify why we need to have African Americans in research participation. However, without them in that, we're unable to apply and generalize what we know to African Americans. Everything from outreach. What are the communities we're looking to see? African Americans are not monolithic. Are we in the South? Are we rural? Are we in the Midwest? Are they highly educated? Who exactly are we thinking about? So without them, we have no understanding of who they are. But also with evidence-based interventions, what is the likelihood of them taking up with that? Does it fit into their lifestyles? Is it something that they see as having a purpose? And then as we move forward in Alzheimer's research, developing drugs, what's the efficacy, of that? Does it work for them? Does it cause harm? Is it something that they're likely to take? So what is ultimately missing is the perceptions and lived experiences of African Americans. Ultimately, we are living in a climate of health disparities, meaning these things are largely preventable, differences in health, but more so the opportunity to achieve optimal health among African Americans that research is able to provide. So I do not see barriers or health disparities as an offshoot or a subset of research in health, but really the tapestry or the way of what we are right now. So traditionally, we think about trust, the big barrier of research participation, and we think about the Tuskegee study. However, I argue here that it goes centuries back, and I say it started when the first enslaved Africans arrived in North America. Because that power imbalance, that structure, how are we to go forward in an equitable way if we started in that way? So we know that as seen as property and not people, we're having painful, involuntary experimentation with African Americans, primarily African American women, as the birth of American gynecology. So I argue that it goes back decades, but we're still reaping the consequences at this point. I'll briefly touch here that health disparities and barriers to research shapeshift, meaning how, with that history, we're seeing higher rates of poverty, incarceration, even if you're doing well as an African American, maybe more tenuous housing, lower employment rates, also education. This tapestry is still uneven, creating those barriers. So I like to think of 5 points as the essence of all barriers, really paying attention to the top 3 because they're like sisters, so one cannot exist without the other. I would like to call your attention to these 2 here, as they work pretty much in tandem. Through every barrier that I will outline subsequently, we have 2 parts. One, oppression. So not hearing the voices or wanting to hear the voices of a certain group of people, whether implicit or explicit, the outcome is still the same. So we have to think about that. But then the subsequent anger associated with that may masquerade as fear or mistrust. That ultimately leads to ignorance on behalf of research, our findings, as well as for African Americans themselves. If they are not meaningfully understanding what's going on with their health, their outcomes, we're talking to each other and we're living lives with a brick wall between us. And that leads to ultimately silencing a whole group of people based on the lack of research participation. So we have exclusion and disparate treatment. So I like to think of barriers as having a structure, and that's how I will outline them. So we have the top, systemic, and this is what I call the matrix. So it means that it's always there, but you never really see it. It's like they, or the man, or something that is behind all of us, but influences all of us without us being able to see it. What's a little bit more salient or visible is communities in which we reside and their resources, and institutions in which we work and conduct research. And then highly here, which I work very closely in, is what goes on in the home, friendship networks, and who I am, say, as a woman of color. So I won't belabor this. We know that through each of these structures here, we have trust, distrust, mistrust, lack of trust, medical system overall, physicians and researchers as a subset or offshoot, and ultimately perhaps even mistrust or distrust in ourselves as African Americans to truly think that we can contribute. So with my time, I would like to break up barriers into 3 big areas. Macro, that's systemic; meso, the community and institutional; and then micro, inter and intrapersonal. So that means that they're all talking to one another. So what happens systemically impacts communities, which impact people, but also people comprise communities and institutions. So it's very porous, the way that barriers work. However, I will do my best to point out some specifics. So with systemic, I see it as an overarching system of patriarchy. So what I mean by that is built into it is racism, discrimination, and seeing a certain group of people, African Americans, as other or less than, and that's how we started out. But really so is the value of participants, their bespoke lived experiences, their perceptions. How are they seeing their needs? How can we meet them halfway? Big point here is transparency. We talked a bit about this yesterday and earlier, but who is the system? How are we using our data? What are the outcomes? One of my big areas that I really like to focus on is community and institutional. I see a huge barrier as a lack of communication and engagement with African American communities, meaning just not when you want to do the research, but all the way before, during, and after research, meaning having a presence in diverse African American communities, not simply say what you may perceive as low income or low education, but across the spectrum that shows the lived experiences of African Americans. But even still, if you have people who want to be involved, how do they know where the research opportunities are? Where are we advertising? How will they get there? Where is it located? Do I have sufficient time to take part in that? But a big piece is what will happen, even if I do participate. What will be said about African Americans? Am I going to contribute to the negative narratives that are out there about African Americans? Is it going to be something that's wrong with me or my group of people or how we're bad? And that's where it really comes into outcomes being unknown and potential negative meaning making. Okay? But also with in the home, friendship circles, yourself, there's also maybe a lack of support in the community around research participation. Are you reluctant to share that you belong to a study? What does that mean? How do you think about yourself? If I am a research participant, does that mean that I'm somehow going along with an established view of me and my people? That could be a barrier, but also a big part would be the self-esteem and confidence in that we have a voice to contribute. So what does it mean for me to participate? I'm sure others will figure it out or someone else will participate, but that leads to a lack of empowerment of African American communities that creates the lack of engagement and education to go forward with research participation. And I highlight some others here that I am open to talking more about offline. But in my program of research, I rarely think about things just as, say, barriers or health disparities. I think about health equity. So not equality, meaning everyone gets the same thing, and so if I start out at 2 feet and I get 2 more, I'm still 4, but someone else starts out at 8 and they get 10. So I'm thinking of equity, meeting people where they are with the resources that they need. That is understanding the complexity of the African American community. But I try to talk about briefly facilitators of research because there are African Americans highly invested in research and also maybe curious. So you can have a big facilitators, African Americans themselves, understanding that they influence others, both in their homes, their communities, and society as a whole. We have a unique perspective that is unparalleled in the United States. And I think having that empowerment, we were able to say, despite the grievances against us in the past, if we're allowing non-Latino whites, who are the majority of research participants, to create the narratives for our health, what control do we really have over that? So it's weighing the pros and cons of what would I like to see for myself, my future, and my community. And that's an element of altruism here that I see quite a bit when I'm out in the field as well as doing my own work. But also a facilitator is being involved in research from conceptualization. I don't mean from when you first start writing the grant, but is merely when we're thinking, we're in this space. Who are these people? Who is the local African American community? Not at large, but who are the people that we will be sampling from and how can they be involved here? But community members must be willing to what I call cross the academic line, meaning seeing researchers and others as people with challenges who want to be educated as well on the communities there, but other facilitators being research as low risk, personally beneficial. This is a big thing that I fight for, financial incentives and knowledge gained. So here, this part here, the cultural competency, I see it as a facilitator for both community member and researcher. So for researchers and scientists, we have to understand in order to have African American participation, engagement, education, we have to be culturally competent. And that doesn't mean just respect, that's the minimum. It's understanding who we're speaking to, it's understanding what we're asking for, and it's understanding what is being asked of us, which is highly important. But one of my big things, I love mixed methods, I'm a mixed methodologist, so I marry quantitative and qualitative together. So qualitative allows me to have the participant perspective, They can be heard, I can be heard through my research purpose, and then we can come together to identify what are perceived needs, real needs, and then solutions going forward, or how they may think about the work that I'm doing. And I'm really proud of the work that we do at the RADC that has this model called Engage, where we give first, then advocate for research, and then give back, okay? But I think the big part is being a citizen scientist. So as a Black woman, I constantly think of, would I ask my father to do this? Would I ask anyone else to do this? And how would I frame it? And what do I need to know before I make such a request? That takes time, I understand that, but at least a cursory understanding will come through in interactions with other groups of people. So ultimately, we have to think about from both ends, community members and researchers, what is the bottom line here? And that's really understanding that the African American experience in all its diversity deserves a place within research and science, and not say as a special population or as an offshoot, but as integrated fully, as being a myriad in this society so we can make research work for all of us. I just want to say thank you to the Knight ADRC, Dr. Morris, Dr. Elliott, Dr. Silverberg, for having me here. And I hope I didn't go too fast, but I'll welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glover. Now we'd like to invite Dr. Jennifer Manley to the podium. Dr. Manley is professor at the Taub Institute for Research on Alzheimer's Disease and Aging Brain in the Department of Neurology at Columbia University Medical Center. Dr. Manley.
Thanks very much. It is really an honor to be here among these tremendous talks today. I'm going to try to emphasize life course mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease disparities. And in doing so, I think you'll find that when you have the privilege of asking questions about life course mechanisms, they tend to focus on social forces. I found it interesting that the interpretation in the audience of Dr. Holtzman of the results at WashU was that there must be something genetic driving those differences. And actually, I was sitting there thinking about all the social forces that might be driving those differences. So you'll see how different the perspective is, I think, when you are lucky enough to have a successful engagement and partnership with the community, and what those partnerships are trusting partnerships in research. It changes the way you study Alzheimer's disease. It changes the way that you study disparities. You begin to think about the entire life course as leading to some of the mechanisms that drive disparities. And again, those mechanisms seem to be, you'll see in my talk, social forces. Okay, here are the collaborators that I work with and the funders that support this work. I'll be showing some pictures of some of my collaborators. This is Wei Ming Watson, who is in the process of re-upping one of the core presentations from the YCAP study, which is that African Americans and Hispanics, mainly from the Caribbean, are at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. These are incidence rates in our cohort, and you see they're higher. I'm going to fly by the next two slides. These are results from the Health and Retirement Survey, also showing increased risk. These are prevalence rates of cognitive impairment in African Americans and in Hispanics. And then in a different way of looking at Rachel Whitmer's cohort, in her study with Elizabeth Rose Maeda, that African Americans were at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So these disparities are present in several studies around the United States. And one thing to keep in mind, again, another way of talking about the survival bias that Dr. Whitmer brought up, is that the older people get, the narrower these disparities are, because only the most hardy African Americans survive to old age. So Laura Zahadny found in the YCAP cohort and in the MIDAS cohort, which is a national study of midlife, that disparities in episodic memory narrowed in the oldest old in each of those cohorts. So what we're talking about is a distortion of the impact of some of these risk factors if we only study older people. This is work from Adam Brickman showing that white matter hyperintensities are more prevalent in African Americans and Hispanics in the YCAP cohort. There's no interaction with age here, which is a puzzle because we're not born with white matter hyperintensities. As you can see, we only started scanning people after the age of 70 in this cohort. So it points to, again, this life course issue. We need to back up into midlife with African Americans because there's accelerated aging, and the inflection point where African Americans are getting more of these white matter hyperintensities happens way earlier than when we normally recruit people for studies of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Brickman and Laura Zahadny also found that using structural MRI studies and white matter hyperintensity volumes, those volumes were not related to cognitive test score among the non-Hispanic whites in the YCAP study, whereas they were related to cognitive function among African Americans in the study. And conversely, hippocampal volume was predictive of incident dementia among non-Hispanic whites in the cohort, but not associated with future incident dementia among non-Hispanic blacks. So each of these studies has large sample sizes. We did MRIs on now over 1,500 people, but in this study it was about 750 people were included, and suggests that there are different mechanisms that lead to Alzheimer's disease across race. This is not from my study, this is from the Health and Retirement study. Sam Liu did some research on discrimination and telomere length. So I'm referring you to some social forces that might affect the biological mechanisms that lead to aging processes, just such as those that affect risk of Alzheimer's disease. She found that experiences of everyday discrimination in this large cohort, the Health and Retirement Survey, was associated with shorter telomere length, but there was no association of discrimination with telomere length among whites. And the mediators of that relationship between discrimination and telomere length included physical activity, smoking, and obesity. These are data, again, from the YCAP study. We have have been very successful in recruiting people across the education range and have a large number of people who are illiterate. They did not attend school and never learned how to read and write across race and ethnicity. And Gloria Felix and Miguel Arce are just completing a publication showing that the illiterates are at higher risk of developing dementia than the literates. And these people were all matched on years of school, so in the YCAP cohort we're able to show, because of, again, some of these life histories, there are people who didn't attend school but learned the basics of reading and writing. So we're able to isolate the effects of literacy on later life cognitive decline. Those of you who've seen my talk before know this slide by heart probably because I show it every time, about how we've been, again, when you're successful in your partnership with diverse research participants, you are asking questions. And early in my career at Columbia, I went to the homes of the African Americans in the study, and I was asking them questions about acculturation. I was interested in their cultural beliefs and practices and traditions and how those might relate to performance on cognitive tests. And it was there that I learned that well over half of the African Americans in the YCAP cohort who are in northern Manhattan were born and raised in the South. And they told me about their educational experiences. I began to look into this as playing a possible role in neuropsychological test performance. And I'll spoil my own story. It turns out to be, in our hands, the most important factor driving cognitive decline and disparities. African Americans attended schools in the South that were open for much less time. In fact, almost half the time that white schools were, and in the South, and also schools in the North. This is from elementary school data. Schools were one-room schoolrooms in the South, and this is a way of summarizing the information in a collaboration with Maria Gleamore at UCSF. We've been looking at quality predicted years of education using census data, and show that there are massive differences between blacks and whites as time goes on, and certainly by state and by region. This is again Sam Liu, who found that these regional differences in school quality are tied very closely to cognitive differences later in life. This is with the Health and Retirement Survey cohort, finding that disparities in these cognitive outcomes are wider in the South, among people who were born and raised in the South than those who were born and raised in the Northeast or the West. Maria Gleamore also finds this geographic difference in Alzheimer's disease and all-cause dementia mortality by race and place of birth. Again, a different way of showing what Rachel Whitmer looked at in the Kaiser cohort with Paula Gil-Sands, that where you are born, you bring it with you. So these people in this cohort lived all over the country. But even if they were born in a stroke belt or a southern state, they were more likely to die of Alzheimer's disease and all-cause dementia. Again, with Maria Gleamore and Audrey Merchland at UCSF, we're using the Regards cohort. This is a cohort that was originally intended to study stroke across the United States, and are finding that these historical levels of school quality in this graph, term length, drive returns to years of school. So you can see that those people, regardless of race, if they grew up in a county, this is county level data, grew up in a county with a longer term length of school, they have a better payoff in terms of cognitive function to their years of education than people who grew up in counties with fewer where the school year was shorter. In YCAP, we find we're breaking down what are the causes of disparities across race. In Model 1, I just have race predicting incident Alzheimer's disease, and you can see that black race is a significant predictor of higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. We do find there are cardiovascular risks that increase or cardiovascular conditions that increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. I'm accounting for stroke, but you can see it does not fully account for the race effect in Model 2. And years of education is another risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease, but again, it does not fully account for the race effect. It's not until We add a proxy for school quality, which is reading level in this cohort in Model 4, that the disparity across African Americans and whites in this cohort is accounted for risk of incident Alzheimer's disease. And now I'm going to quickly go through some research that overlaps with the wonderful work we saw in the Indianapolis Iban study, but I want to highlight it because I want you to really hear this, that some of these data on secular trends in Alzheimer's disease are pointing to years of education, changes in years of education as the main explanation for why later born cohorts are at lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. In the YCAP study, we found that that is the case in African Americans, that the incident rates of Alzheimer's disease in later born cohorts has gone way down, and that is completely explained by years of education. I want to remind all you guys that I just showed some policy data, and largely the reason why years of education went up in African Americans is that compulsory school laws changed in those states where African Americans were born and raised and then enforced. And so that is why years of education is higher in later born cohorts. And so policy can affect later life health. Yet Vonk, who's a postdoc in my lab, also looked at cognitive decline across cohort and found that there was less memory decline. This is not incident dementia data, but this is longitudinal change in cognition, that those people who were born later were less likely to have memory decline. This is true especially in the African Americans, and again explained by higher years of education in the later born African American cohort. And finally, Lily Kamalian is looking at using Amy Kine's area deprivation index that was published recently in the New England Journal to look at block level deprivation. This is census level data that we have in the YCAP cohort. You know, it's been very interesting working in this neighborhood because just building by building, block by block, there are huge differences in socioeconomic status. And this is another example of using social forces data. Here it's residential segregation and residential SES as an additional possible explanation for racial differences in later life cognition. So I want to conclude by saying that when we have had very successful, trusting relationships with our communities, and when you are able to achieve those relationships, you can have large studies of diverse people, and that research leads to, when you listen to your research participants, you're going to hear that life course issues are an incredible, powerful part of their later life experiences. You start to realize that your research needs to start earlier. We have been leveraging studies that have baseline in midlife or earlier because there's accelerated aging among African Americans. We've also been leveraging studies that directly collect data early in life. The Project Talent cohort is one example where people were studied when they were in high school in 1960, and now we're finding those people in their 70s doing remote cognitive assessment and asking about what happened to them between 1960 and today. You'll also find that national studies are really the only way to comprehensively understand how social forces affect cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease mechanisms. I want to point out there's Shelley-Ann Levy is in the audience, and just recently at the Friday Harbor Conference using YCAP data, she showed that among African Americans, relative affluence among African Americans buffered the effects of risk on Alzheimer's disease prevalence. So there are important, Jonathan Jackson, important within group differences that when we have large representative cohorts, we can examine. And also hopeful, I think, sources of resilience. So educational experience, family, socioeconomic status, experiences of discrimination and job discrimination, residential segregation, and psychosocial factors like locus of control, all probably modified by sex and gender across race, are important social factors to take into account. If you measure them, then you can ask the questions about these social forces and find that perhaps they are more meaningful or more predictive than genetic and biological factors, and they may interact with those factors to explain disparities in Alzheimer's disease and also are important points of intervention because many of these social forces are modifiable. Thank you.
So Crystal, you can come on up, and Dr. Bird is going to moderate Q&A, and we have people with microphones, so they'll raise their hand.
Okay.
Let's see how much time we have. We go to 10:25.
10:25, got it. Okay. Does anyone have a question for either of our speakers?
I'm Dave Notman from Mayo Clinic. Jen, I just directed at you. I appreciate your presentation, and in my experience in the ERIC cohort, the education disparity between African Americans and whites, it clearly shows. What I wanted to ask about, though, was a comment you had made to Dave Holtzman a second ago, or when you started, I guess, where Dave saw mechanisms and you saw socioeconomics, and as if they were divided. And I really don't think that they are. And I think this brings up a semantic issue that pervades this conference. You were talking about cognitive impairment symptomatically, about dementia mainly, and with that, I'm 100% with you. When we're talking about etiology, though, it seems to me that Dave's comment is still quite pertinent. And the problem comes when we use the word Alzheimer's disease indiscriminately. What you were generally referring to was either just dementia or clinically diagnosed Alzheimer's disease, which we know is at least 30% and probably more misdiagnosed, even in research studies and in neuropathologic community studies such as from Rush. The burden of cerebrovascular disease is huge. So I think that to avoid being misled by etiology, I think we need to be clearer with our language, and especially in communities where there is an increased burden of cerebrovascular disease, refer to it as dementia, not as Alzheimer's disease. You want to respond? Thanks.
A lot to unpack in there. Let me just answer it this way. I think we could probably go on for a long time discussing this. Let me just answer it this way. We're using biomarkers in our research. We're getting PET amyloid and tau in the YCAP offspring cohort. We do ask for autopsy confirmation in the YCAP study, and we have that. We don't show any differences in YCAP of those people who agreed to autopsy in our sensitivity and specificity of our Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. So, I mean, I'm not misled. I know what I'm talking about when I say Alzheimer's disease, and I know what I'm talking about when I say dementia. And I agree with you. But I agree with you that, you know, we do need specificity. And what we're showing in our research, and what I think some of the research that's emerging is showing, is that what we thought were the precursors and the etiology of some of the neuropathology that we associate with Alzheimer's disease, amyloid plaque and tau. It's a more complicated story when you look in community-based cohorts. And I think that, you know, one thing I just want to caution is, as wonderful as the studies coming out of Emory and Washington University St. Louis are, there are different reasons that African Americans come to the clinic and that African Americans agree to have CSF taken. So concluding something about the mechanisms of disparities or mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease from those volunteer cohorts, it's a mistake. It's a mistake. Though clinic-based cohorts have their place, but they are not going to reveal what we need to know about mechanisms of disparities. And so basically, you know, I think I agree with you, Dave, that, you know, we need more specificity, but the trick now is to incorporate some of these biomarker studies in representative cohorts, not clinic-based cohorts. Okay.
Yep.
Scott Roberts, University of Michigan. I just want to thank our two speakers for some fantastic insights. Maybe as a follow-up to the previous question, I think, Jen, your talk really highlighted the importance of longitudinal cohort studies that begin in midlife, and I noticed, you know, the HRS was a great resource. I guess I'm interested in your views on the prospects for research moving forward in leveraging those kinds of studies that maybe dementia is not the original focus of. Do you think we have promising longitudinal cohort studies already underway where we could look more into dementia as an outcome? I'm thinking even of the new All of Us national cohort study. Do you think there's promise in that or other maybe projects that we haven't heard about today?
I absolutely think there's promise. I mean, Dave Knopman just mentioned the ERIC study. I think the imaging studies going on in the ERIC cohort are amazing. That was a cohort not originally intended to study cognition. It was originally intended to study cardiovascular disease. The Jackson Heart Health study is a part of ERIC, but also a larger cohort in Jackson, Mississippi that was currently just approved to add cognition to the core battery, and there are a number of R01s going in to focus on imaging and cognition in that cohort. I mentioned the REGARD study, which is a study of over 30,000 people across the United States. We're now doing a cognitive brain health study in regards. And so, I mean, just resoundingly, yes, I'm sure there's tons of people here who can think of other cohorts that were originally intended to study cardiovascular disease or diabetes or you know, child health. That these are people who are now in midlife and who this is the right age. This is exactly the right age to start thinking about cognition and brain health and to better understand how the entire life course affects risk for Alzheimer's disease. Hi, Mary.
Hi. Great talks, and I think part of the dialogue has really begun because I think that Dave has brought up an interesting point. I want you to consider this, and actually I'd like both of you to tell me what you think. We have huge numbers of Alzheimer's disease, and as Dave has said, many of them are not but we've used those numbers to bring the money together to solve the Alzheimer dementia problem when we look at these numbers in a population base. Yet the narrative is driven by two proteins that may or may not be prominent in the breadth of our populations that cost us so much money for having this disease. And you spoke earlier about owning, Crystal spoke about owning the narrative. Perhaps if we broaden our concept of what dementia means in the life of people, looking for new biologies that might be really relevant, we would have a right to ask them to engage with us. And I wonder if you could make comments on that possibility, that by narrowing for our focus on a few of the biologies, which may be very important for a subgroup, we've really missed the range of biologies that might be important for the groups that have this disease perhaps even more prevalently.
Thank you for your question. I actually think Jen would be even better suited for that answer. However, I do think that understanding what is most important or most impactful for African Americans and particular groups or subgroups therein is important, and I think narrowing the scope, my biggest concern would be the recognition of that narrowing within our population or within African Americans, and understanding how they think about dementia or how they think about Alzheimer's, and then knowing that if we are narrowing and using those resources, that we are transparent with that. So that's my biggest concern, but I think that is viable.
Yeah, I would just say, echo that I think that when sort of, Goldie outlined these steps of doing your research before you do the research. If you do your research before you do the research, then you recognize that it's the cognitive decline and loss of independence and the frightening, the frightening specter of losing your ability to care for yourself and your family and to contribute that's driving people. And so while I think, now we have a framework for definition of Alzheimer's disease that's biologically based, it is hard for people to understand what's going on, and we should acknowledge that barely any ethnic minorities were included in the research that led to that framework. And so I think, and we talked about earlier, sharing results with people. We don't understand, I think, what the implications are of that biological framework for Alzheimer's disease on how people will act when they receive a biomarker-based definition. And we especially don't know that across race and ethnicity, because the people who've participated in those studies, including the one in San Diego, are primarily non-Hispanic and white and well-educated.
I think we have time for one more.
Here's one.
Good morning. My name is Diane Lewis. I'm with UC Davis, and I do outreach with our Lavender seniors. Those are our LGBT seniors in the Black community, and I was just curious if any of your research has uncovered how being suppressed in their gayness affects or is a determinant factor for Alzheimer's.
That's a great question, and that's kind of what I was hearkening to with understanding the complexity of the African American experience. I see burgeoning research, especially out of UCSF with Jason Flatt, understanding how intersectionality, so say you're African American, Black, how does that couple with sexual orientation that is deemed non-normative? And so as we see with these individuals getting older, so I'm a big proponent of understanding Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive decline, et cetera, earlier, even further than midlife, because I believe that the trajectory is there well before. So once the person has decided living their lives as an LGBTQIA person, what trajectory does that put them on? What resources are available to them? So in short, I believe the research is just now catching up, or at least starting to explore the intersectionality of the Black experience. So I think it's coming. It'll be a tad slower, but I think that's a rich question. Very interested in that.
Is there? Oh, in the back, yes. Oh, there's Dr.
I'll be very, very fast.
Yes.
Stephen Thomas, University of Maryland, College Park. I thought I saw a spark, that this thing started to heat up. That's a good sign. We can't have a conference like this unless we have some heat. So here's my question. Now that we talk about ideology and biology, is Alzheimer's disease different in Black people than it is in white people?
It depends on your definition. And I mean, if you define the disease as two pathologies that have been used as the definition for many, many years, then you've already come full circle. You've already answered your own question. If you think that Alzheimer's disease is amyloid and tau, and that's all you're looking for, and that's how you define the disease, then the answer is no, it can't be. It can't be different.
Right.
I think, even if it is just amyloid and tau, in the way that we've been defining it, it's possible that there's higher prevalence of amyloid or lower prevalence of tau in African Americans, that it starts earlier, those neuropathologies start earlier. So even if you restrict your definition to those two neuropathologies, it could be that Alzheimer's disease is different across race and ethnicity. If you listen to the neuropathology studies that have come out from Rush, from the Honolulu Asia Aging Study, and you recognize the complex nature of the neuropathologies that are associated with the clinical syndrome of Alzheimer's disease, I think, and if you look at the research that we've been presenting so far, I showed you some MRI images. I think the imaging results, I think the answer is yes. And and I, like the framework, am proposing a hypothesis that all of you can test in your research. So I have a hypothesis about it. We're looking for different mechanisms, and it's a challenge for everyone in the audience to pursue.
And may I add one thing to that? A slightly different perspective. I agree with Dr. Manley here, but I do think it's different in terms of the lived experience. So meaning the resources available, the stress that is caused in caregiving or not knowing which resources or hospitals, et cetera, to take on. And then also almost being behind a curtain in what does this mean for me going forward, being more than memory loss, but then also my quality of life. So I would venture to say, being so unique as African Americans, I think it is different.
So let's take a moment and thank Goldie. And Dr. Manley and Dr. Crystal Glover. That was terrific. And yeah. On session 3, success in African American research participation. Crystal Glover, when she arrives here, will be the moderator, but to get things going, I'm going to introduce, she's a professor of gerontology and geriatric medicine at Rush University, and she's going to talk about ongoing efforts for brain donation in minority populations. So let's welcome Lisa. So this advances the slides.
Okay, there's no slides up there.
Do you have any?
Yeah.
Oh, they will come.
Okay.
And that's the pointer, and that's just the reverse.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, I'm waiting for my slides.
There they are. Great. So good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be a part of this really stimulating workshop. I want to thank Dr. Morris, Dr. Elliott, and Dr. Silverberg, and the Alzheimer's Association for organizing this. So we are all aware of the statistics that African Americans are about 2 times more likely than whites to have Alzheimer's disease. And for a variety of reasons, they're also less likely to be diagnosed in a timely fashion and 40% less likely to get treatment. These alarming statistics are against a backdrop of non-inclusion and underrepresentation of minorities in clinical research. This is despite the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research and a policy issued in 2001 by the requiring clinical research grantees to address inclusion of minorities. And as we move within the field in which the disease is defined by its underlying pathologic processes that can be documented either by post-mortem examination or in vivo by biomarkers, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for minority populations, particularly older African Americans who are at higher risk, yet generally not included in biomarker or pathology studies? A quick search on PubMed of studies over the last 10 years revealed few AD biomarker pathology studies with African Americans, shown here on this slide. At Rush, we are working to change this picture. Today in my presentation, I will briefly describe our study design that we use across all of our cohorts at Rush and focus on 2 of our African American cohorts. I will then share some of the lessons that we've learned in doing this sort of work, and essentially it can be boiled down to 3 things, 3 main strategies. 1, we work with the community, not on the community. 2, we try really hard to ask the right questions. And 3, we do things to help us sustain the work. And finally, I want to end with some data, even though I wasn't supposed to show any data, but to end with proof that our strategies do actually work when we try to implement these things in the community. So let me start by describing the longitudinal clinical pathologic study design that we use in all of our cohorts at Rush. Everyone enrolls at baseline with no disease, and then we follow people annually over time, measuring their cognition at each annual evaluation. In this way, we're able to measure change in cognitive function over time, incident mild cognitive impairment and incident AD. And in some people who come to autopsy, in our majority white population, our studies, Ross and MAP, organ donation is required. In our community-based minority studies, it is an optional component. But in those studies, when people come to, when they come to autopsy, we're able to measure a range of pathology from no pathology to more pathology. So in one single design, we can correlate the risk factors we learned about them when they were living to change in function over time, to incident disease, and to pathology. So we have 2 cohort studies at Rush that focus explicitly on African Americans, the Minority Aging Research Study, known as MARS, and the Rush Clinical Core. Together, these studies consist of over 1,000 older African Americans without known dementia at enrollment, living in Chicago metropolitan area and outlying suburbs. All agreed to annual detailed clinical evaluation for common chronic conditions of aging with detailed evaluation of risk factors, and everyone gives blood. Both studies use a harmonized cognitive battery, and we have a common core of risk factors. Now, this harmonized battery is used across all of our cohort studies in the Alzheimer's Center, so we're able to merge the data to look across race and ethnicity when we want to. As I mentioned, these two studies have organ donation as an optional component, but we are actively recruiting for a brain donation, and we have greater than 50% who've expressed interest in donating at the time of death. They signed an Anatomical Gift Act, which is a legal document allowing us to harvest the brain, and we have more than 70 brains to date of people who initially started the study without dementia. So our first lesson is working with the community, and the approach that we use is the ENGAGE model that you heard about earlier in Dr. Glover's presentation. This is spearheaded by our outreach and recruitment core, led by Dr. Shaw and Dr. Glover, and it's essentially a consumer-centered education outreach model that has been adapted over time to meet the needs of the community, of this growing, diverse community. And the goal is to foster bidirectional relationships between the community and the researchers. So as shown here on the slide, and our outreach and recruitment focuses on an integration of activities at multiple levels. There are activities that take place at the community level, where we work initially with stakeholders and community organization leaders to build relationships. These interactions provide insight on how to best give first to meet community needs using services supported by our Alzheimer's Center. This community engagement then leads to presentations educating the community about the value of research participation and encourages recruitment and retention into specific research initiatives. The next level is at the individual study level, where we determine interest, we confirm interest, especially when you're dealing with organ donation and minorities. We consent, we enroll, and we retain. Regardless of whether community members agree to participate in specific research initiatives, however, we have a cumulative knowledge base from all of these initiatives that we are able to give back to the community for discussion and for determining new community networking opportunities. The final step is this circle here in the middle, where we seek input from our community participants and our community members, from everything ranging from the research questions that we need to be asking, prioritization of outcomes, design of the study, execution, and dissemination. Each step in the process is monitored, and activities are continuously refined to better facilitate recruitment and retention efforts. But it's not just a theoretical concept for us, it's really a lived experience for us as researchers. And our motto is, in the heart of the community, ever seeking to win the community's heart. Because at the end of the day, what seems to work best for us locally in Chicago is having these life-to-life connections with our participants, where we can build trust and strengthen relationships. Now, with any model, you have to be able to evaluate your progress. So at each step in the ENGAGE model, we have measurable activities that can serve as metrics to measure our success. And these are just a few examples of some of the things within each step that we track within the ENGAGE model. The second lesson that I want you to take home is that we really need to ask the right questions. Now, we've been studying and working with minority communities for almost 2 decades, but the NIA Health Disparities Research Framework came out recently, and it's really consistent with the approach that we take, where there's different levels of analyses across a life course perspective. And in our studies, we look at a number of different culturally and socially relevant risk factors that we think may impact the aging process, and we want to know if it impacts the underlying biology that we see in older African Americans. The third lesson is the importance of sustainability. There are a number of initiatives that facilitate strong relationships and foster a commitment to the study. Remember, our goal is to obtain brains from our participants, so we need to be able to retain and keep them engaged until the end of their life. So we do a number of things to make participation easier. All of our visits are done in the home. We never have anyone come to Rush unless they want to. We provide incentives as far as the study results are returned to participants. We give tokens of appreciation. We build relationships with participants by hiring culturally competent staff, often from the same communities that our participants come from, and we make sure that the investigators are known by the participants. So when I started Mars in 2004, I went to visit every single participant in their home to explain their results, to thank them, to answer questions, and to build rapport. And those people are still with me today because of that relationship building. We maintain contact between yearly visits because, we see people every year and we don't want to lose them. And we pay attention to the evolution of study needs. We have learned that there are many medical and social resources that older minorities need as they age, and research often will take a back seat to some of those things. So we recently hired a social worker to help us connect people to services. We have retention specialists whose sole responsibility is to come up with innovative, creative ideas of how to keep people engaged in the study. And we're learning through organ donation work that it's important to really engage beyond the participant. We have to start looking at family members and finding innovative ways to work with family members. So I'd just like to give an example of how this is actually bearing fruit, these kinds of strategies. We've heard in the meeting and we know that the characteristic hallmarks of Alzheimer's are the amyloid plaques and tangles. But in our studies of mostly whites from the Ross and MAP studies, we know that the vast majority of people who have dementia actually have mixed dementia. It's not just the plaques and tangles. We really didn't know what was happening in our African Americans. So in one study, we looked at African Americans and whites who were in our memory clinic. So they had a diagnosis of dementia. When they came to autopsy, we looked at the patterns of pathology in the brain. And what we found was that African Americans were much more likely to have mixed pathology compared to whites. Whites were much more likely to have Alzheimer's pathology as the reason for their dementia. But we know that people who show up in the clinic are not representative of the community. So we wanted to look in our cohort of people who start the study without dementia. And this is an ongoing study. I told you we have about 70 brains so far. So in people who start the study without dementia, we don't see any race differences in the patterns of pathology, but we do see that pathology has a differential effect on risk of dementia. So here I'm showing you a model where Alzheimer's pathology is associated with an increased risk of dementia, and so is microinfarcts. But there's this really interesting race by microinfarct interaction that we see, and I'll show you what that looks like. If you just have Alzheimer's pathology, your risk is increased. The more Alzheimer's pathology, the greater your risk, but there's no difference between blacks and whites. If you add macroinfarcts, these are the gross infarcts that you can see, nothing's really going on there. But when you look at microinfarcts, you see that the association is much stronger for blacks with microinfarcts as far as dementia. So studies that focus on organ donation are obviously time intensive and require multiple layers of contact with participants as well as their families. But I think, from the conversations that we're having today, I think we can all agree that we need all kinds of studies. We need population-based, we need studies that can really go in depth and get pathology data, because this is a complicated disease. These strategies, though, to make this work have to be consumer-centered, they have to be culturally relevant, and they have to be sustainable. Having these kind of data on African Americans will allow for inclusion in the cutting-edge biology that's currently driving the field, whether we like it or not. We have to be a part of the conversation. And it may help to shed light on disparities found in the clinical studies, especially if we're able to pair the biology with the social forces that we know are at work in minorities' lives. Thank you very much.
Lisa, you didn't. Okay, I'm going to turn the moderator function over to Crystal.
Thank you. Great job, Lisa. So our second speaker is Dr. William T. Hugh. Dr. Hugh is an associate professor of neurology at Emory University. He is also a neurologist specializing in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And through his CSF biomarker lab, he is seeking to identify, validate, and translate meaningful biomarkers. Please welcome Dr. Hugh.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Dr. Morris and NIA for making this possible, and I also want to again acknowledge Dr. Newman and Dr. Manley for firing up the crowd so that we can talk about our little study that could. So I'm going to try to stay, these are my disclosures, and stay away from the science for a little bit, but I'd be happy to come back and talk about some of the interpretations at least we're working on. The first question people are very often is, why CSF? And this was actually based on clinical experience that when I was training at Penn, we would share the results back with the patients. And very often, African-American patients who presented with clinically probable AD at the time had CSF profiles that just didn't make me feel comfortable saying that it was Alzheimer's disease. And this experience continued when I moved to Emory. And so there are a couple explanations for this, a few explanations for this. Number one, the autopsy-based study was wrong. You know, that we didn't have the right cutoffs, and we just couldn't tell people that definitively that this was Alzheimer's disease. Number two, that it wasn't Alzheimer's disease, it was something else that was causing dementia, even though it looked like Alzheimer's disease clinically. And finally, maybe the CSF tau profile distributions were different between races, and I will come back to some of these very simple terms that are very complex when you get down to it. So this study was made possible again by the effort of Dr. Monica Parker, my partner in crime, who started this Registry for Remembrance in Atlanta in 2008. At the time, this was designed to improve African American participation in aging studies, and quickly, relatively speaking, 130 registry participants enrolled to be contacted. The majority of the people, over 70%, almost 80% of them, consider themselves as having normal memory, and 15% of the people consider themselves having some memory issues, but were still living and functioning independently. What happened next was that very few of them got calls back. And the reason being that at the time, our center had predominantly clinical trials, interventional trials, rather than investigator-initiated studies. So there were very few studies looking for healthy African Americans to participate. And this led to a little bit of the waning enthusiasm. We were also, at the time, following the 2008 recession, there were limited funds, discretionary funds, to say, okay, let's go ahead and get spinal fluid MRI on this healthy aging population. So what our recourse was, we submitted an R21, which was funded, to perform a series of biomarker characterization using spinal fluid MRI to determine whether the CSF and MRI signatures of dementia /and/or Alzheimer's disease and are similar between Caucasians and African Americans across multiple diagnostic categories. These are the lessons I learned. Number one, like the previous speaker mentioned, it's important for the investigator to meet the participants. But at the same time, I may not be the best ambassador for this study. Some of the participants who have actually gone through the study, some of the early participants may be much better ambassadors. And I want to acknowledge Ms. Beverly Foster, who's abandoned us at Emory and joined WashU as an advisor. So not only was she a participant, she was an ambassador for our study. So we actually put together a YouTube video sharing some of the participants' experiences. And not all of them had great experiences, but that's part about the transparency. A lot of these people were scared, and we want people to know that, yes, there are other people who are scared. Number two is that during the process, I became very cognizant of how difficult it was to define what I'm studying, what we're studying. I think that in some of the standardized census forms as well as the documentations, it is easy to put numbers or check marks next to Caucasian African American. But in a study like this, it became very challenging to do so, especially in the Southeast. And so we fully recognize the complexity and heterogeneity within each very mixed racial group. And we know that there are many other forces at play that may influence the biological presentation of the same disease as well as the risk factors to develop diseases. These are obviously not things that we have answers for, but I think the first step is to recognize and to actually learn from the participants that these are some of the issues at least we need to account for in future studies. So number 3 is we need to return the new knowledge that is generated. Some of the study results that have been mentioned already, we return the results to the participants, not at the individual level, but the group level findings. Dr. Parker hosts the twice annual Carter Center forums where we engage the community, including participants as well as potential volunteers, to share with them what is being done to the spinal fluid, what is being done to the MRI data. And then finally, this year or last year, we started the research luncheon so that even I get a free lunch out of it, even when I go share my study results. This issue was something that worried us a lot before we started the study, and we actually took a bit of time to investigate the details of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis. We have some of the original documentations in Atlanta from the study because of CDC's involvement. But to our surprise, when we asked potential participants, according to race, why they did not participate in the study, why they said no to us, you can never do that, in other situations. But we asked them, why did you say no to us? Tuskegee came up one time out of how many ever no's we got. And the personal concerns regarding the safety of lumbar puncture, what it involved, the risks, as well as what information could be gained, significantly outweighed the historical memory of Tuskegee. I want to also show that we showed the numbers here in terms of African Americans and Caucasians as percentages. When it comes to absolute numbers, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two races. We've noticed that from our participants that it was very helpful to have the person, the scientist, not just the PI or the co-PI, to be on the ground sharing what is being done. And this is Christina Howell. She's the first author on our little paper. And by being able to explain to the participants what the science being done was, instead of just fluid being banked, that we got much more willingness to participate in the study, in the sense that there was a goal in which, at the end, we want to help better understand the disease among African Americans. What's important is that we are now finding more and more differences beyond just tau. So Dr. Morris already mentioned that amyloid is about the same, tau and phospholipid levels are different. We now have a menu of analytes that differ significantly between older and middle-aged, healthy African Americans and Caucasians. And in terms of the tau values, we've now gone back to the early age, at least in the 20s, and these differences persist as early as that stage. What that means, we don't really know. I think we are rather agnostic about some of these things, so I think we're doing many follow-up studies to address some of the questions that are already being raised in terms of whether this is a different Alzheimer's disease, this is a different presentation of the same Alzheimer's disease, or it's not the same disease altogether. It's important that in our experience, to demonstrate safety, and we actually prospectively followed up on each of the participants after they had a lumbar puncture, and we asked them very agnostic question, were there higher complication rates in African Americans compared to Caucasians? The answer was no. And what we did find is that fear and normal cognition, like many other studies before us, are predictors, but certainly race was not one. And finally, I believe that it's important, at least in my experience, in our experience, to have a critical mass of investigators interested in this topic. Dr. Parker, as I mentioned, Dr. Whitney Wharton, who is analyzing a middle-age cohort, a graduate student at Georgia State who's analyzing the MRI patterns and changes, and other investigators from elsewhere studying different aspects of the relationship between race and what we know as Alzheimer's disease. At the same time, I think there are many challenges that remain, as we heard earlier, and as I think we'll continue to hear. We now have a lot of hypotheses, but very few samples to actually test these hypotheses. And in order to make some of the scientific observations more meaningful, we need a larger cohort. We need not only internal validation, but also external validation. And I think this is something that we really need a national cohort for. And for now, we actually have a study participant advisory group on which hypotheses we should pursue, and at least help us decide beyond just scientific reasons, what are some of the social and other reasons to pursue certain questions. Like I mentioned earlier, African Americans are not homogeneous, and they are Afro-Caribbeans, and I think we're starting to study some of the differences between African Americans and African Caribbeans. There are many recent African immigrants to the United States, and who have very different genetic background as well as social experience. And there's great income inequality even within our cohort. And in Atlanta, obviously, many of you are aware that there's the public hospital, Grady, which recruits a very different population than the other centers. And how do we adjust for that, even within our study, is an ongoing challenge. Race beyond African Americans is also a continuum. This is a 2015 study using data from 23andMe that talk about the genetic admixture between self-identified African Americans and self-identified Caucasians. And we saw this firsthand in our study, in that some of the Caucasians with no firsthand knowledge of intermarriage in their lineage actually carry genes that had a 0.003% chance of appearing in Caucasians in northern studies. So I think this type of study actually implicates not only African Americans, but also Caucasians. And finally, like we heard already here, what are the implications of these findings? I think these are the things that sometimes keep us awake at night. We have evidence that neprilysin levels are different between African Americans and Caucasians. In Alzheimer's disease, this is an investigational type of marker. In cardiovascular disease, there's already a drug that is marketed to both Caucasians and African Americans to block neprilysin. What is the impact of that? I think we obviously need more studies to fully understand it, but I think the pace of research cannot keep up with the pace of this drug being prescribed in the market on a daily basis. We heard about the implication of tau and tau therapy trials. Do we enroll African Americans in the same tau targeting trials as Caucasians? Do we deprive them of the opportunity to benefit from this? Or in the future, others in being eligible to receive it as clinical therapies if we decide to exclude them? How do we design clinical trials because of what we know? I think these are really important issues, like a panel like this we need to discuss beyond just the initial observations which we're making. So I want to thank everyone for your attention, and thanks again, John, for making this happen.
Thank you again to Dr. Hu. Our third speaker is Dr. Jennifer H. Lingler. Dr. Lingler is an outreach, recruitment, and education leader at the Pittsburgh Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Dr. Lingler is also an associate professor of nursing and medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. Please welcome her to the stage.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Morris, for your leadership. Thank you, NIA, for your support. I think that this gathering is in many ways a manifestation of the unprecedented attention that African American participation in Alzheimer's research is receiving. So very grateful to be part of this and to tell you a little bit about our vision in Pittsburgh for using narrative or storytelling approaches to increase diversity within the clinical core of our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So we're grateful for support from NIA for these endeavors. I'm not going to spend much time on significance, as I think this has been well covered by the previous speakers. I will also move pretty quickly through orienting you to the traditional approaches to recruitment that we've been using at our Alzheimer's centers. I think it's not all that different from some of what we've heard this morning. I am going to talk a little bit about what I see as a potential for a paradoxical effect when we use health disparities messaging to try to encourage research participation. And then I'm going to go over some of the key elements of the narrative campaign that we're getting started in Pittsburgh. So I don't think that any of the bullets on this slide are surprising to anyone in the room. The only one that I'll highlight is the review by Coakley et al., that's the third bullet down, is a reminder that 5% of clinical trial participants are African American. That was across studies of common chronic disorders. So it's a reminder that our struggle to increase diversity as Alzheimer's researchers, we're not alone in this challenge. And I understand that a goal of this gathering is to generate a plan for action and some initiatives that we can undertake. So I think it's important to recognize that quite possibly the outcomes of this gathering could have implications for our colleagues who are studying other conditions. This infographic shares information about some of the impact of dementia syndromes worldwide. In the United States, I think it's been made clear this morning that African Americans shoulder the burden of dementia and other late life cognitive disorders at a disproportionate rate as compared to Caucasians. And that's true across many metrics, whether the metric is symptom burden or whether it's economic. There's data to suggest that African American families spend disproportionate amounts of out-of-pocket costs on informal care of individuals with Alzheimer's disease. What I'd like to just emphasize in terms of significance is that when we make the case for increasing African American participation in dementia research, the significance is twofold. So there's, on the one hand, the need for more generalizable samples or information, the results. On the other hand, there are cognitive health disparities that can only be understood and ultimately combated by including more African Americans in our research. So it's twofold at least. There may be other rationales. In terms of our traditional recruitment approaches, I'm sure the strategies listed here look pretty familiar to folks in the room, and our essential mission is to try to minimize the burden associated with being a research participant and to maximize the potential benefits that an individual may gain. And how do we do this? We use print materials and web-based materials, everything in between, including the boots on the ground work of our outreach coordinator, Melita Terry, who's here today. So one of the things that we do oftentimes, and I don't think we're alone, is to highlight to our African American stakeholders data on the cognitive health disparities that we've been discussing this morning. So this image happens to be from the Alzheimer's Association, but I could have also clipped one from one of our brochures at Pitt or from our website, where we highlight the statistics suggesting that African Americans may be 2 times as likely to experience Alzheimer's disease as compared to Caucasian counterparts. And I want us to reflect on that for a moment. And in order to reflect, I'm going to give you some information. What if I were to tell you that there's data to suggest that people who work in Alzheimer's research, so investigators, study coordinators, staff, who work in the field of Alzheimer's research are twice as likely to experience substance abuse disorders as compared to researchers in other fields? What if I were to tell you that people who work in Alzheimer's research, investigators, staff, et cetera, are twice as likely to suffer from substance abuse disorders as compared to people studying other diseases?
We're having wine for lunch.
So I've given you information that you haven't heard. By the way, this is not true, but I've given you information that you haven't heard before about a potentially stigmatizing condition. What I'm willing to, yield some of my slide time to. What was going through your? Someone said, "What did you say?" Right. So she needed to hear that again.
Yeah.
Right. And what were you starting to think about?
Because it's stressful.
It's stressful. Someone else, real quick. So didn't believe it. Okay. So and by didn't believe it, you're probably too polite to say. You're saying, who is she, right? What is her credibility on this issue? Or maybe I seem pretty credible, and you're wondering, well, is the data credible, right? Where did this information come from? How was this generated? What else? What's that? Okay, oh yeah, we've been underfunded for a long time, so yeah, right. Someone says, not me. It doesn't square with my reality, doesn't resonate with what I've seen in my colleagues and the people that I care about, right? Okay. A potential study, someone said? Okay. I'll leave that to NIA. Right, so, and I barely, because I don't have much self-control, I could barely allow for the pregnant pause that was necessary for that reflection. But what if I had gone on to say, and you know what, this problem that we have is affecting our ability to be effective mentors, so it's going to affect the field for years to come. Other nations are outpacing us in the development of better care delivery models for dementia care, so that the people that we're devoted to are suffering from this. I could have really gone on. And again, it might not have been the most productive start to a conversation about investigator health, right? So presenting a public health crisis and laying it at the feet of the community can potentially backfire. And I say leading with this kind of information, leading with disparities messaging can be off-putting. And the first time I ever saw this in effect was at a Community Advisory Council meeting in Pittsburgh. And we had a very eminent researcher explaining to the advisory council a bit about these cognitive health disparities. And one gentleman had worked as a technician in the coroner's office. That was his job in life. And he said, we did lots of autopsies, and I saw brains of blacks, whites, everyone. I don't remember noticing any more evidence of Alzheimer's in those African American brains compared to the Caucasian brains. And in his words, I do qualitative research, so I love quotes, and his have haunted me for years. He said, "We've already got diabetes, hypertension, and now you want to pin Alzheimer's on us." Again, when you create a sense of urgency, you need to have a way for people to realistically respond to it, because it can be off-putting. Okay. So moving on very quickly, my colleague Ishan Williams at the University of Virginia calls this kind of disparities messaging deficit modeling. She says, and you know what, quite frankly, people are tired of the negative comparisons. So what if instead we talked about the positive things that so many of our African American volunteers are doing to be part of the research process? If you're going to do that, you need to do so in a way that emphasizes culturally relevant aspects. So this model was developed to consider how we can have a culture-centric approach to health promotion. In our case, of course, the outcome of interest would be research participation, not necessarily engagement in health behavior per se. To break it down, because it's a little bit overwhelming, the first task is to develop narratives or stories that have a subject who's personally engaging, and the characteristics are outlined by Larkey and Hecht here, of an engaging character that has an engaging story and is culturally embedded. So this is what we're trying to do in our new study in Pittsburgh. And we've just started year 2 of a 5-year project, and a significant proportion of the labor goes into developing these narratives. We'll move on to, of course, disseminating those narratives in manners that are effective and that penetrate, right? And ultimately measuring the outcomes. Again, in our case, it will be increasing participation in research. So in terms of using narrative to promote research participation, there's not a lot of published data on that. Actually, Dr. Hu just gave us an example of that in his talk. He talked about the YouTube videos in their study and how effective they were. We don't see enough published and well-controlled. This slide has a couple of examples, and I think the one I like best is from Washington University here in St. Louis. The reference somehow got cut from the slide, but this is Amy McQueen's work. She's in your Division of Health Behaviors, and what I liked about her study is that she had a very controlled way. She used videos to provide information about breast cancer survivorship, and she was able to compare videos that used narrative or engaged in storytelling with a content equivalent informational video, and found that both cognitive and affective responses were stronger in people who had viewed the narrative. So just moving on, we did some pilot work at Pitt, developed a brief 3-minute video. We used existing focus group data that we had to try to embed cultural relevance into the story of Mary, a research participant. And then we ran that video by a focus group of African American individuals from a local senior center. We surveyed them about the video, and we tried to hit on elements that were that speak to those personal elements and culturally relevant elements from the model that I presented. And people seemed fairly receptive to it. During the focus group, people made comments such as we could relate to her. So that suggested, again, back to the model, that it was realistic. She looked like us, so they could identify with her. But then here we were, that it fits African American individuals was also mentioned. So that was promising. So that gave us some promise. One thing that gave us some pause, in the video we did present basic information about Alzheimer's and statistics, including disparity statistics, and you know what? There it was. Right out of the gate, the first person to speak in the focus group said, "It says it affects African Americans more so." I don't think that's right. That's my opinion. So here we are, it's non-productive. Now I'm having to defend the data that was presented, right? It's not necessarily where we want to go, leading with that. We have other signals that storytelling might be helpful. We had recently a fantastic response to the Forget-Me-Not play in Pittsburgh, which tells a story like none other. However, getting people together in a room is a massive undertaking, so we want storytelling approaches that can be disseminated far and wide. And so for that, we're developing a series of vignettes that we will use in all of our messaging to try to enhance African American recruitment. So right now we're in phase 1, which is developing these vignettes, and we're doing them using information from ethnographic interviews so that cultural relevance piece can come through. Running short on time. So while we're doing that, what I will mention is this is a sequential cohort design. So while the videos the vignettes are being developed, we're monitoring recruitment under a usual strategies condition for 1 year, a second year with heightened social media presence, and then the third year will be social media plus the storytelling, so that we can control for the effect of social media, because we hope to use social media to really do these. So just a little bit of emphasis on who we've interviewed for our ethnographic interviews. Just to mention that we've worked hard to have a heterogeneous sample of African American individuals, so looking at a range of education levels, although they're all on the high side because these are research participants, varying time at our center, men and women, people from suburban and urban areas who have different kinds of educational backgrounds, because again, if we only heard one kind of story, we don't think would be real effective. We've also tried to vary them in terms of recruitment sources. Partnering with a group called Frameworks out of DC, who specializes in public health communication, because we really want to get these vignettes right before disseminating them. Dr. Elliott asked me about data so far from the new study, and the one thing I'll just say is that within the ethnographic analysis, the ethnographic interviews, we've had no one spontaneously tell us that they participate in Alzheimer's research because they are trying to increase diversity in AD research. They're trying to redress a historical wrong, that's their motivating factor. We just don't hear that from people. We also, to last night's point, what we often hear, we ask people, who do you talk about your participation with? And they tell us, no one. They don't tend to talk about the fact, they're very enthusiastic about volunteering for Alzheimer's research. They don't tend to talk about it with friends and family. So those are two telling things from that data so far. I believe that I am out of time. So I would just like to acknowledge my fabulous collaborators and our team. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lingler. So we have our final speaker for this session, Dr. Raina Croft. Dr. Croft is an assistant professor of neurology at Oregon Health and Science University. Dr. Croft is a medical anthropologist and also serves as faculty in the Latent Aging and Alzheimer's Disease Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Croft.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm an anthropologist, and I'd like to begin by defining a couple of terms. So when I talk about belonging, I'm talking about creating a research program where participants feel supported, they feel understood from both a historical and a current socio-political perspective. They feel celebrated, they feel heard, and they feel connected to the research aim, to other participants, and to the research team. And when I talk about culture, I mean the research team and the participants operating within a shared set of values as it pertains to the research. So what you see here in these concentric circles are essentially the values in which we operated, and I will take you through these layers that we worked through to ensure that our design and implementation of the brain health intervention was truly culturally celebratory and reflective of community-identified priorities. And so we asked ourselves a series of questions, and I hope that these questions could be useful to other researchers and to community advisory board members. They can be asking the researchers that they're working with. So how will you intentionally create a culturally celebratory tone throughout the research? How are you creating opportunity for new researchers? How are you serving a community-identified priority? And what tool or service will continue to serve that priority after the research? And finally, how does the intervention go beyond being culturally relevant to really engaging and celebrating African American culture? So part of setting that celebratory tone is celebrating the role that participants play in helping prepare the next generation of cognitive health researchers. And so throughout our research program, we were updating participants of our mentees' progress. We invited them to student talks. We provided them with paper copies and digital copies of posters, translating those posters so that they make sense to community members. And we were really sending the message that we were curating a sense that this is a mutual endeavor. So we held focus groups with Preserve Coalition for African American Brain Health in Portland, Oregon, and the Urban League of Portland. And out of these 4 focus groups, we made sure to include one focus group that was specifically the LGBTQ community. And as we listened to community, to what people were saying in the community, to our question, what are some of the barriers to healthier aging? We found that with the rapid gentrification in Portland and approaching these sessions with a beginner's mind, even though I am from this community, we heard that with displacement to outer-lying areas outside of Portland, that there were transportation barriers and that these contributed to older adult isolation in both the old neighborhoods and in the new neighborhoods where they were relocating. There was an increase in division of families as families moved from intergenerational homes in historically Black neighborhoods and into apartments into the outer-lying areas. And so there was an increased dispersal of social supports. And we were also hearing that walkability decreased in the new neighborhoods and that there was a decreased motivation to walk and socialize in the new neighborhoods, or in the old neighborhoods, because people no longer saw a reflection of themselves in the younger white demographic. And of course, there was also a decrease in neighbor dependence and trust, and all of these are important for healthy aging. And one thing to keep in mind is that in Portland, the African American population is 6%. And so curating a sense of belonging in what has been called the whitest city in America, let alone in Alzheimer's disease research, is not necessarily an easy feat. And so we wanted to make sure that the modalities we would be using would really reflect the community's concerns. And so we know that the community was telling us about, they were lamenting the disruption to social engagement because of gentrification. They were lacking motivation to walk in new and old neighborhoods, and they really wanted to, there was a sense of urgency to preserve history that was being lost to gentrification. And we also know that these modalities are also shown to improve cognitive health. Social engagement, improving cognitive reserve, walking, decreasing global cognitive decline, and 2+ hours more a week of walking improved Alzheimer's disease patient scores, attitudes, and MMSE scores. And then reminiscence, improved brain function and well-being. And so we wanted to see, well, what happened if we put all three of these modalities together? What would happen at the center where they intersect? What would be the motivational factors, and what would be the cognitive health impact? And so we had participants walking in groups of 3 for the course of 6 months, so walking 3 times a week for 6 months, with historical neighborhood images that prompted conversational reminiscence that was being recorded. And we did this within in the historically Black neighborhoods and within a culturally celebratory context where we were using culturally celebratory images and questions and celebrating the contribution of our up-and-coming young investigators. So at baseline and at end study, we performed a Montreal cognitive assessment. We took measures for weight and blood pressure. We had a health survey. And then at weeks 4, 12, and 24, we had focus groups where we were evaluating the study so we can continually refine the study so that it meets the participants' needs. And so using neighborhood images from 1940 to 2010, which is the period in which African Americans really thrived within the historically Black neighborhoods, we developed 72 walks, because 3 walks a week times 6 months is 72 walks. And we developed these 72 walks within about 27 themes that we created. And this process, the testing of the technology, is published in the Gerontologist, so you can learn more about that there. And this is an example of the variety of culturally celebratory images that we were using when we combed the archives and when we asked community members to also contribute images. So we weren't just using photos, we were also using store flyers, we were using artifacts like the Civil Rights button, and this artifact which is a theater ticket. And so this is what the walking application looks like. Participants would select, well, there'd be one participant per the triad would select a walk on what you see on the first screen. And all the walks are 1-mile loops for convenience, and at 3 points along the walks, there are GPS-triggered memory markers. So that's the celebratory images and questions that come up that allow for the conversational reminiscence that is recorded. And so in 2016, we were testing the technology funded by the CDC, and in 2017, funded by the Alzheimer's Association, is when we were really looking at the cognitive health impact. And so the average participant was a working, college-educated, 67-year-old single woman with, I saw the word with, single woman with 45 years life experience in the historically Black neighborhoods and still living there. And so out of the 21 participants, we had 2 people in each triad who were cognitively normal, paired with 1 person who was experiencing mild cognitive impairment according to their MoCA score at baseline. And so our retention for both years was quite high. 2016, when we were testing feasibility, it was 71%, and 86% in 2017. And so looking at the baseline to end study results for the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, we see that half of the participants had improved scores at the end of 6 months of walking, and 5 of those were people experiencing mild cognitive impairment. And so I think what's really striking here is that the average change in points for people who were normally cognitive participants was just under 2 points. But for people experiencing MCI, it was almost 4 points. We also found favorable outcomes for mood. When we asked people, compared to when I started, my mood right after a group walk, 83% in month 1 and 94% in month 6 said that their mood was improved. And since the group walks began overall, 100% of our participants said that their mood has generally improved. Now, take in mind that this is after walking through the historically Black neighborhoods, their neighborhoods that are being gentrified, and these walks often evoke negative emotions and sadness at the loss of community, yet still they were saying that their mood had generally improved. And so we asked people to rank what was motivating about this approach to brain health. And you can see here with the score total on the bottom that participants were about 2 and 3 times more likely to rank these factors as extremely and very motivating. And so as a qualitative researcher, of course I wanted to look beyond the numbers and look at what people were saying about motivation. And so in coding the qualitative data from focus groups, we did indeed find that celebrating the accomplishments and including our participants in the updates about what our mentees were doing, these are 2 representative quotes. The way the research team presents the SHARP program, and when they see who's in charge of it, they're so proud, first of all, that the principal investigator and the team members, that you guys are there and that you're in charge. Another participant says, I'd like to be involved, and I think so-and-so does too, because we want to help support you young folks. So accountability and peer support, we also found, was highly motivational for physical activity and social engagement. And these are actual photos of our participants. So one person was talking about how they used to just sit around and watch Wendy Williams, and now they say, it's like you don't got time for the TV, you've got to get somewhere, and then you've got to be there on time, and you've got to participate, and you have to do the walk. After you do the walk, it's been rewarding to know that other people my age are active. Another participant says, I have truly enjoyed the camaraderie, the opportunity to walk and exercise together, and again, being close to the group. And so one thing that we weren't quite expecting is that participants expressed these walks were helping them heal from the trauma of gentrification. One participant explains that it made me walk past my mother's house, and I had not done that since she passed away. My walking partner said, come on, come on. Then I started talking about all the changes and the people that lived in the community and what they did at that time. But it was part of my growing, and I had to do it. Peer support, in light of the healing from the trauma of gentrification, was also a motivating factor. A participant says, my husband said to me one day when I was coming home after the walk, are you sure you want to still do this? You get so angry. And I said, yeah, I'm sure. As I tried to tell him, it's an opportunity for me to express myself with people who understand exactly in my experience exactly what I'm feeling. And finally, it says my timer, I got 3 more minutes. And finally, I would like to say that in considering aligning individual health benefits with the community benefit, this quote I feel is really powerful when we're talking about a sense of belonging. It's for us and it's for the community. It's for our mind, it's for our body and the exercise. And so just in conclusion, I would like to reiterate that we created a culture of belonging by celebrating African American mentorship, by approaching community priority with a beginner's mind, even if we are a researcher from that community, to make sure that the intervention really reflected community-identified priorities that participants could connect with beyond our initiative of brain health. And I feel like we took the sort of abstract notion of this blob in our head that we need to maintain, and we translated that into a meaningful experience that dually served individual and community health needs. So I would like to thank all of our mentees.
Raina, Dr. Croft, Dr. Barnes, Dr. Hu, Dr. Lingler, to the front for questions. Thank you. First question, anybody?
Got one down here.
Hi, thank you everyone for your talks. I'm Annie Racine, I'm a postdoc at Harvard. What I really appreciated about this group of speakers is I feel like you presented some really actionable ways to take everything that we've learned and apply them to our studies to increase African American participation in research in a culturally sensitive way. But there was a lot of information, and I'm wondering if you have any advice as a group or individuals and in your centers on the best way to take all the different information that you presented and others from different centers and bring them together and maybe think about a way of taking all that information and integrating it in a way that would apply to all of us, and so that we can use it and start doing that in our own research right now.
I'll take a stab at it first. And I think one thing that I have to say is that your experiences may vary. So just because it's worked at one center in Atlanta, it doesn't mean that the same model applied elsewhere will give you the same results. But I think certainly that, that a central repository of the different approaches without a guarantee of an outcome would be informative.
Yes, I would echo that. I think it also depends on what your outcomes are of your study. So like in our case, where we were doing something, that hasn't really been done in African Americans trying to get organ donation, we really felt that we had to really get to know the community first and understand really intimately what the barriers are before we just said, oh, this is hard, it can't be done. So I think really assessing what your outcome is. If you're looking at a large population-based study, you may not need to do this individual level community-based work. Clearly though, you can't just put up a flyer and wait for people to show up. I think that's been pretty well documented that does not work for minority communities. But you kind of have to figure out what you want to get out of it.
So in preparing for the intervention I just showed you, that was several years in the making, meeting with leaders to understand a broad picture of community priorities, then meeting with smaller community groups to get individualized stories about how they experienced those priorities that were discussed on the ground, how it impacted their lives, and then finally meeting with other focus groups specifically talking about brain health and their experience of brain health and how they understand the terminology that we're using as well. And so I think that it's a long trajectory to gaining support and being present so that people can see that you're invested in the community, not just for this research, but for the long term, and that you're willing to incorporate their priorities into the research and not solely focusing on what you, under your researcher assumptions, assume are the priorities.
Second question here, I think right to the back or there. There we go, right to the top, guys, to the top.
Thank you for your presentations. Again, they were very useful for being very specific. I am wondering about the narratives that you mentioned. Your focus groups mirror those that are participants in the ADRC. And so would the narratives need to change to reach different education levels that are not participating?
I think that question was for me. The pilot video was viewed actually by, I should have specified, no one in that focus group that viewed the pilot video was actively participating in Alzheimer's research at the time, and that was part of our design, just the point that you made. And yes, we do plan to have the videos that are produced as a result of this current endeavor viewed by both by non-participants, for sure.
Hi, Jonathan Jackson again. I have a deeply cynical question for the panel. How do we know that the positive effects of the interventions that all of you mentioned, which all seem wonderful and all very different from each other, aren't just the byproduct of one underpaid, overly enthusiastic person who's willing to show up in the community again and again and again? How do we know that that isn't the real treatment effect that we're seeing here?
Well, ours was a pilot, so we don't know. And with more data, I think that maybe we will be able to answer that question.
Yeah, I agree. You need resources to actually be able to test these things and to isolate key ingredients and measure their effectiveness. You need massive resources. So the study that I described might sound simple, but it is a 5-year endeavor, and we're taking that, again, year where we do have a new outreach coordinator, and we've joked about the need to control for the Melita effect because she has been very successful. And had she come aboard at the same time that we were deploying our new materials, we would have been in danger. But hopefully she stays with us so that that effect remains constant throughout the study. But carefully monitoring recruitment under usual conditions. Again, then 1 year with usual conditions plus social media boost, because that was another potentially effective strategy. And then layering it with that third piece and trying to do it. But that takes resources, and we're grateful to have funding to try to do that and try to isolate what's working.
And Jonathan, I know you know this, I'll remind you that recruitment is a science, and there is a long history of it. Peggy Dilworth Anderson has published some really nice work showing, looking at different recruitment techniques and actually measuring the effectiveness of different techniques. So we're talking about it today as though it's a new problem. It's been around for a while, and I know you know there's a R24 on the board for people to test these recruitment interventions. So I encourage all of you to try to get some innovative ideas and go for this R24.
I just want to add that I think it takes more than one underpaid, overcommitted person. I think it takes a team of them to actually make this happen. And I think really the thing I mentioned of a critical mass at your center is essential. Otherwise, I don't think it will succeed.
All right, we have one last question.
Monica Parker from Emory. I'm looking at the panel, and one of the things, and I thank Raina for bringing this up, is I'd like one or all of you to comment on the importance of having an investigator and coordinators who are ethnically the same and culturally the same. I think when you say you can't just put up a poster and expect people to respond, I think that's accurate. But I also think, consistent with what the gentleman set up here, you have to have somebody who's overworked and underpaid to kind of keep the momentum there, to represent the institution in the community, and eventually the higher-ups come along. But usually those community workers are ethnically and gender identifiable to the community that's targeted. So would you comment on that in your respective institutions? And just because this is my big bias, I happen to be a physician investigator, and most of you up here are PhD investigators. And how much physicians are included in your research and outreach? I think that's one of our successful points, but how many investigators are persons of color and medical professionals who are actually treating the population that's targeted?
So our whole research team, except for my mentor, Dr. Jeffrey Kay, we are all African Americans. We're all African Americans in this study. And I think really participants are looking for a human connection. We approach it as researchers, needing to get people into our study, and we've got a phone number for people to call, and we have a poster. But really, the lasting language, I think, is human connection. And with the SHARP study, our participants really felt comfortable that we understood not only the socio and cultural context within Portland, Oregon, but also we had a historical understanding of the unethical treatment of African Americans in medicine and systemically throughout society as well in other areas. So they felt that we had their best interest at heart. They felt that they could trust us and that they could really talk to us about their concerns.
At Rush, we have a multidisciplinary group as well. So we have physicians who are also involved. At the leadership level, we don't have as much diversity, but Crystal and I are the only two African Americans, but we have two Latino investigators. And our coordinators are people of color, and our staff are people of color. But my Mars study is almost all African Americans work on that study because that's how it was started, for us, by us. It's kind of like the theme that the participants came up with. But the clinical core, we have a diverse group of research assistants who go out to see these African Americans. And I think what it boils down to is having culturally competent, regardless of how you look, you have to be comfortable going into these neighborhoods and interacting with participants. I think that's what matters at the end of the day.
Yes. I would just punctuate that with the phrasing cultural humility. I think cultural competence for sure, and then also cultural humility. But yes, we do work to maximize diversity within our staffs and then on the investigative team, for sure.
So I think we're going to have to stop here. So let's thank all of our speakers and Crystal. In just a few moments, we're going to have lunch, but I'm going to make a few announcements and then ask for an audience participation that gives me some discomfort, so it may be discomforting for you as well. But remember, I want all speakers on the program, including the afternoon, all moderators, Dr. Hill and Dr. Ballsbury, when I finish talking, to come here for a photograph, and all travel awardees to come here for a photograph. So one important point, if you have your name badge, and on your name badge there's a dot, you have to pick up at the registration desk an envelope that has travel documents for your reimbursement. So if you have a dot but no envelope, please go to the registration desk and pick it up. Okay, here's the vignette I'm going to explore a little bit, and it's based upon Dave Notman and Jen Manley's discussion earlier this morning, and I'm going to exaggerate it all out of proportion from what actually was discussed. But in essence, one could say that Dave challenged the idea that the life course approach that Jen advocates to evaluate risk for Alzheimer's disease, and that Jen would say it may be at odds what Dave Holtzman brought up in terms of genetic and biologic risks for Alzheimer's disease, maybe Dave said, well, you know, we know what Alzheimer's disease is. We define it biologically, biomarkers, neuropathology. And Jen came back and challenged that, but I wonder, this is the audience participation, whether community members heard Dave, and I'm exaggerating, this is not what Dave said and not what Jen said, I'm using this for illustration. Did any community members think, here's a white male doctor saying, I know what Alzheimer's disease is, I know what it is, and we're going to evaluate you, members of the community, for our beliefs about what it is, rather than hearing a white male doctor say, well, we want to know what Alzheimer's disease means to you. What is your cultural representation of it? Is it the same as what you're asking us to participate, or do you just want us to fall in line with what you think it is, even though it may not correspond to my beliefs? Anybody have any of that sense of it? Anybody afraid? Yeah, please. No, can we come back to that and just, can we come back to?
I just thought that his tone was condescending and that the terms that were being used to say that AD, the term of AD was being used prior to Dr. Manley and Dr. Glover's presentation. So I think he could have asked a question, first of all, because he just kind of stated it in a condescending way.
Did anybody notice that it was a man speaking to a woman?
Yes.
Did it strike anybody as white and black?
Yes.
So this I think is a good illustration of what we white Alzheimer's disease centers have to deal with. Dave didn't mean to be condescending in any way whatsoever, but we have to understand the different perspectives, and if we don't, we're not going to be successful in recruiting African Americans. Does that make sense?